What if I told you that Rome never actually fell, and millions of people kept calling themselves Romans for over 1,000 years after history books say the empire died? Buckle up, because we're about to expose one of history's biggest lies. Quick favor, if you're enjoying this Roman plot twist, smash that subscribe button. Your thumb won't regret it. Here's the tea. Most textbooks will boldly claim Rome collapsed in the 5th century, but try telling that to the millions of Romans still living their imperial dreams centuries later. They'd probably laugh in your face while sipping wine from golden cups. The real story starts with Constantine the Great pulling the ultimate boss move in 330 CE. This strategic genius looked at crumbling Rome and basically said, "New empire, new me." He founded Constantinople right on top of ancient Byzantium, creating what we now call the Byzantine Empire. When barbarian tribes started using Rome as their personal punching bag in 410, Constantine's Eastern Paradise kept the Roman dream alive. For 11 straight centuries, Roman emperors ruled from this glittering city while everyone else assumed the party was over. These medieval Romans weren't just surviving, they were absolutely crushing it. Imagine stepping into Constantinople's imperial palace in the 9th century. Visitors from barbarian lands would literally lose their minds. Graceful stone arches and impossible domes stretched overhead like something from a fantasy movie. But here's where things get absolutely insane. The emperor's throne was guarded by mechanical, golden lions that roared on command thanks to hidden pipe organs. Golden birds sang sweet melodies from artificial trees nearby. And just when visitors thought they'd seen peak luxury, hydraulic engines would rocket the imperial throne toward the ceiling like some medieval elevator on steroids. The emperors still rocked classic Roman style, military uniforms, flowing togas, the complete imperial wardrobe. Their courts ran on traditional Roman law, keeping that ancient legal system pumping strong. Regular folks lived pretty similar lives to their ancient Roman cousins. They farmed, crafted pottery, worked leather, fished, wove textiles, or hustled in the booming silk trade. Same jobs, different millennium, better technology. But these Byzantines weren't just coasting on Rome's greatest hits. Their artists created mind-blowing mosaics that covered entire walls and carved marble masterpieces that would make modern sculptors weep with envy. Their architects built churches that seemed to scrape the sky. The crown jewel, Hagia Sophia, featuring a dome so impossibly high that people genuinely believed it was hanging from heaven by invisible chains. Just casually breaking the laws of physics, no big deal. The empire bred incredible minds like Anna Komnene, a 12th century imperial princess who devoted her life to philosophy and history. Her detailed accounts of her father's reign became historians' primary source for understanding Byzantine politics during the First Crusade era. Then there's Leo the mathematician, who basically invented the medieval internet. His beacon communication system stretched over 700 kilometers across the empire, allowing border guards to alert the emperor about invasions within 1 hour. Talk about ancient instant messaging, but even cutting-edge technology couldn't protect them from spectacularly bad decisions. Enter 1203 and history's most disastrous business deal. French and Venetian crusaders struck a bargain with Alexios Angelos, a deposed emperor's son who promised them ridiculous wealth to help reclaim his throne. Here's the plot twist nobody saw coming. Alexios actually got his crown back, but after 1 year, his own people decided they'd had enough and straight up murdered him. The unpaid crusaders were understandably cranky about their missing paychecks. Their solution? Torched the entire city of Constantinople. Massive fires consumed priceless ancient art and literature, leaving 1/3 of the population homeless. The ultimate medieval temper tantrum. The empire somehow survived another 250 years until Ottoman Emperor Mehmed the Conqueror finally ended the show in 1453. But wait, the story gets even weirder. Even after Constantinople fell, Greeks kept calling themselves Romans for centuries. The name Byzantine Empire didn't even exist until Renaissance scholars invented it 100 years after the empire died. Let me blow your mind with a time-traveling French writer who accidentally stumbled upon one of history's greatest mysteries. Picture this: 1852, and a French guy named Théophile Gautier hops on one of those fancy new steamships. 11 days later, he's walking the streets of Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire's glittering capital. But this art critic turned travel writer isn't just seeing a Turkish city, he's witnessing the ghost of something infinitely more epic. Gautier spent 3 months wandering Istanbul's markets and cemeteries, getting lost in narrow alleys and crumbling boulevards. His artist's eye saw something that made his jaw drop. The harbour packed with ships from every corner of the world, boats gliding in all directions like some maritime ballet. But the real showstopper? Constantinople's incredible skyline stretching across the water. Gautier couldn't believe what he was seeing. It looked so impossibly beautiful that he wondered if it was even real, or just some theatrical backdrop for an Eastern fairy tale, painted by artists and lit by brilliant gas lamps with pure heavenly light. The more he explored, the more he realized he wasn't just walking through Ottoman Istanbul. He was stepping through the ruins of something much older, much grander. While the Turkish locals called their city Istanbul, Gautier knew it by a different name, one that echoed through centuries of European history. Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, also known simply as Byzantium. This was the city that had been Europe's greatest power for centuries, the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survived when the West crumbled. For 1,000 years after what people think of as Rome's fall, this empire stood strong, preserving ancient knowledge in its massive libraries while the rest of Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages. But now, nothing but ruins scattered through Istanbul's streets. Of all the ancient remains Gautier explored, nothing hit him harder than the legendary walls of Constantinople. These weren't just any walls, they had once been famous around the entire world. He wrote about wanting to walk their entire length, but the journey was too exhausting. There probably wasn't a more sadly beautiful road anywhere on Earth. It stretched nearly a mile between a cemetery and a massive pile of ruins. These ramparts were built like ancient fortresses, 2 lines of walls flanked by square towers with a huge moat at their base. The moat was now farmland, surrounded by yet another stone wall. 3 lines of fortification that had once been the stuff of legends. Time, sieges, and earthquakes had done their worst to Constantine's walls. Gautier found himself mesmerized by the overgrown vegetation, now claiming the ancient stones. Fig trees sprouted from tower tops, while vines and grass burst through cracks in the masonry. Here, a massive crack split a tower from top to bottom. There, an entire wall section had collapsed into the moat. But where the stonework had crumbled, nature had stepped in. Earth and seeds filled the gaps. Shrubs replaced missing battlements and grew into trees. Parasitic plants wrapped around stones like natural chains, holding together what should have fallen apart. The entire wall stretched toward the sky, its battered profile draped in ivy and touched with golden sunlight. The whole haunting scene felt like something from a dream or magical tale. Standing there, feeling the weight of the city's history pressing down on him, Gautier could barely believe a living city existed behind those dead ramparts. It was easier to imagine some Arabian legend where all the inhabitants had been turned to stone by magic. Walking along those walls under the soft Istanbul sun, one question burned in Gautier's mind. How could such mighty fortress walls ever have fallen? How could a city that was once the center of the world now be home to scattered rubble and ruins? What in the world had happened to Byzantium's great legacy? To understand that answer, we need to travel back millions of years to when the Mediterranean Sea was born in one of Earth's most violent disasters. 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean was a hellish desert wasteland. Our ape-like ancestors hadn't even learned to walk upright yet. If you could time travel to ancient Greece, Italy, Turkey, or North Africa, you'd see nothing but a dead landscape dropping 1,500 meters into rolling salt flats and impossibly salty lakes. For over 600,000 years, this massive depression had been cut off from the Atlantic Ocean by shifting tectonic plates. The seawater that once filled it had evaporated, leaving behind a harsh, barren salt desert where nothing could grow. But everything was about to change in the most dramatic way imaginable. This vast basin was separated from the Atlantic by just a thin strip of land, only 60 kilometers wide, connecting what we now know as Spain and Morocco. Beyond that narrow barrier, the enormous weight of the world's oceans heaved and crashed. For 600 millennia, those Atlantic waves ate away at the rocky strip. The ocean ground down those cliffs until the barrier was only 30 kilometers thick, then 15, then 5. Then around 5.3 million years ago, that narrow gate of rock finally burst apart. The Atlantic Ocean exploded into Europe in what must have been one of the most terrifying sights in Earth's history. The world's ocean thundered through in a raging torrent, plunging down waterfalls that dropped over a kilometer. This channel carried more than 200 billion liters of seawater every second, equivalent to 1,000 Amazon rivers. Racing at speeds up to 90 miles per hour, the Mediterranean waters rose as much as 10 meters daily, creating a sea stretching 4,000 kilometers end to end. This process might have taken 3 years, but some researchers think it happened in just a few months. The thundering waters triggered earthquakes and landslides we can still see in rock formations today. These caused mega tsunamis over 100 meters high, enough to completely swallow a 30-story building. This deluge, known as the Zanclean Flood, created the peaceful Mediterranean Sea we know today. A vast inland sea connected to the open ocean by a narrow channel just 8 kilometers across at Gibraltar. Europe and Africa were now separate continents, and this sea would shape the entire region's history. Modern humans reached the Mediterranean around 200,000 years ago, spreading from Africa along its eastern coast. They eventually pushed out the Neanderthals and spread around this entire inland sea. When the Ice Age ended and Europe warmed, human societies rose and fell throughout the Bronze Age. But from about 530 BC, one city on this sea's shore had been steadily growing in size and power. That city was Rome. Rome succeeded because it mastered organization, mass production, and military expansion. By 220 BC, its iron-armed legions had conquered all of Italy and its islands. By 140 BC, they'd spilled into Spain and conquered ancient Greece. The Romans created a financially self-sustaining expansion system. Each new conquest provided the economic base for even more expansion. When they captured the Macedonian treasury in 167 BC, they virtually abolished taxes in Rome. Conquering Pergamon in 130 AD doubled their state budget. Rome's expansion seemed as inevitable as those ancient torrents pouring through Gibraltar. By 70 AD, the entire Mediterranean was surrounded by Roman territory, stretching from Scotland's hills to the Sahara's sand dunes, from the Atlantic to Arabia's deserts. The Romans built roads, postal stations, public baths, and theaters throughout their empire, but they also ruthlessly exploited conquered lands and exterminated resistors with extreme cruelty. In the 2nd century, 5 great emperors ruled, including Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. While wars raged at Rome's borders, peace and prosperity reigned within. But this golden age wouldn't last. The first cracks appeared with a devastating plague in winter 165 AD. Roman troops besieging the Parthian city of Seleucia near modern Baghdad began experiencing terrifying symptoms. The Greek physician Galen described these frightening occurrences. Young men developed slight coughs that became stronger, bringing up scabs and bright fresh blood, even pieces of throat membrane. This horrifying illness spread rapidly through the troops. We don't know exactly what this plague was, but it might have been smallpox combined with measles. It quickly spread up Mesopotamian rivers. In the besieged city of Amida, Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus described horrific scenes where corpses scattered through streets were too numerous for proper funeral rites. Pestilence was added to the citizens' other calamities as bodies became full of worms and corruption from heat and disease. These Roman soldiers unwittingly carried this invisible enemy straight into the empire's heart. The plague spread among Rhine River garrisons, then south along trade routes, finally reaching Rome's densely packed metropolis. The Assyrian writer Lucian describes Roman houses standing empty with magical symbols painted on doors to ward off evil stalking the streets. Chinese Han Dynasty records also mention plagues around this time, suggesting a worldwide pandemic. This Antonine plague killed around 2% of the empire's population, roughly 2 million people. In worst affected areas, mortality reached 30 to 40%. This weakened the empire at a crucial time, devastating sea trade and critically weakening the Roman military. As plague peaked, Rome's political world collapsed. The violent, selfish Emperor Commodus was crowned as dead littered the streets, beginning Rome's long decline. Rival generals fought viciously over rule, burning cities and wasting the empire's energy in pointless civil wars. By the 3rd century's end, the vast Mediterranean empire could no longer be ruled from its declining birthplace. Rome was crippled by corruption, and its people suffered from what Romans believed was caused by bad air, malaria, which we know today as malaria. In a desperate bid to restore order and end civil wars, Emperor Diocletian ordered the empire split in 285 AD. Western Europe and North Africa formed the western half with its capital at Milan. Eastern regions, including modern Greece, Turkey, Syria, Israel, and Egypt, became the Eastern Roman Empire. Both halves would be governed by 2 rulers each, creating the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. This division was supposed to end the brutal civil wars hollowing out the empire from within. It didn't work. The Tetrarchy collapsed, and civil war rocked the empire again. A devastating 20-year conflict saw Emperor Constantine fight rivals for control. During these wars, Constantine made the remarkable decision to convert to Christianity, a young religion based on worshipping a Jewish rebel who had protested Roman occupation of Jerusalem. Constantine defeated his rivals, reunited the divided empire, and established Christianity as its official religion. But he would make an even more remarkable decision, constructing a new capital in the east. He considered various options, but ultimately chose a city sitting right where Europe and Asia met. A small Greek trading city in the Mediterranean's Far East, known to Greeks as Byzantium, but which Constantine would have called by its Latin name, Byzantium. That narrow valley connecting Europe and Asia had its own violent birth. Around 7,500 years ago, rising sea levels from melting glaciers pushed Mediterranean waters against cliffs blocking the Bosphorus Valley. Beyond this barrier lay a large freshwater lake. When the dam finally broke, the Mediterranean spilled through in unstoppable quantities. Up to 50 cubic kilometers of water poured over this ledge daily, 200 times Niagara Falls's flow. The lands beyond filled with salt water, flooding an area the size of Cuba. Stone Age people witnessing this flood must have been terrified. they told their children and their children's children. Along with Persian Gulf flooding around the same time, this event might be one source for the biblical Noah's flood story. This body became the Black Sea, bordered today by Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. That narrow valley where the flood poured through is now the Bosphorus Channel, where Asia and Europe are separated by just 750 meters at their narrowest point. A second channel, the Dardanelles, sits 300 kilometers west, where ancient Troy once stood. Between these narrow entryways lies the world's smallest sea, the Sea of Marmara. Right here, the city of Byzantium was founded. Byzantium was an ancient Greek colony founded by settlers from Megara around 667 BC. Folklore says Prince Byzas of Megara founded the city after the oracle at Delphi gave him haunting advice. You must sail and search for the land opposite the city of the blind. The oracle at Delphi was built where volcanic gases vented through Earth's crust. Priestesses descended into chambers flooded with these gases, sending them into trance-like states to give prophecies. Following this advice, Byzas sailed through the Dardanelles into the Sea of Marmara. On the Asian side, he saw the Greek colony Chalcedon, but immediately realized the European side was far better for a colony, a defensible position with a large natural harbor. Chalcedon's settlers had been blind to miss this perfect spot. Byzas landed and named his city Byzantium. The advantages he saw were indeed formidable. It sat right at the Bosphorus's narrowest point, where Asia was less than a kilometer away. This natural crossing controlled all land-based trade between continents and all shipping between the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Swift currents through the narrow channel made sea attacks extremely difficult. The city's harbor was a long, sheltered river estuary large enough for 1,000 ships. The Golden Horn, named either for enormous wealth flowing through it or rich yellow light blazing on its surface at sunset. Pinched between the Golden Horn and Sea of Marmara, Byzantium was perfectly wedge-shaped. Attackers could only approach from one direction, making it virtually unassailable. For most of its early history, Byzantium wasn't major, though wealthy. Only 40,000 people lived here, compared to over 1 million in Rome at its height. But it was abundant. Roman geographer Strabo wrote about rich fish stocks from the Bosphorus Channel. So numerous they were caught by hand, providing considerable income. Despite natural defenses, Byzantium was conquered several times by Persians, Spartans, and Athenians. Roman Emperor Septimius Severus even besieged and burned it during civil war. When Diocletian split the empire, Byzantium was chosen as the eastern capital. Finally, in 330 AD, Constantine chose it as the entire Roman Empire's new capital, writing, "We have resolved that my rule and kingdom's power be transferred to eastern regions, and in Byzantium province, on an excellent site, a city be built in my name." Like ancient explorer Byzas, Constantine saw his reflection in this golden city. He renamed Byzantium after himself, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine. Today we know it as Constantinople. The city was also called Nova Roma, New Rome. Constantine immediately began enormous construction, transforming Constantinople into a city worthy of empire. He laid out a new square at Old Byzantium Center, the Augusteum, with a Senate house and basilica on the east, while the Great Palace rose on the south. Byzantine poet Marianus wrote about the city's early beauty. Where land is cut by the winding channel whose shores open to the sea, our divine emperor erected this palace. O far-ruling Rome, you look from Europe at Asia's prospect, whose beauty is worthy of you. Near the imperial palace sat the vast hippodrome for chariot races. Its 450-meter track held up to 100,000 spectators. 8 four-horse chariots could race simultaneously, an electric spectacle. Nearby were the famous baths of Zeuxippus, adorned with opulent mosaics. 5th century writer Leontius invited a friend. On one side I have the Zeuxippus baths nearby, on the other the race course. After seeing races and taking a bath, come rest at my hospitable table, then in the afternoon you'll be ready for other races. Constantinople even built its own obelisk for the Hippodrome, 32 meters tall, exactly matching Rome's Circus Maximus obelisk. This was a clear statement that Constantinople equaled the Eternal City. Around 330, Constantine built imposing city walls running between the Golden Horn and Sea of Marmara, closing off the wedge-shaped city. The first Christian emperor claimed an angel guided him on wall placement, building them far from old walls. An impressive statement about expected growth. He was right. In the next century, Byzantium exploded in size. By the 5th century's beginning, the city had spilled beyond Constantine's walls. We can trace the city's expansion in advancing wall rings like tree rings. By 404, Eastern Emperor Theodosius II embarked on an even more ambitious project, new walls 2 kilometers west. These stretched 6.5 kilometers, massively increasing the enclosed area. But these walls also testified to the increasingly dangerous world surrounding the young capital. Vast migrations from Eurasian steppes, pushed by unknown forces, were crossing into Roman lands. The Roman state, crippled by civil war, struggled to cope. Writer Synesius summed up impending doom in a speech to Emperor Arcadius around 399. Everything balances on a razor's edge. The state needs gods and the emperor's assistance to crush the danger troubling the Roman Empire so long. 2 years into his reign, in 410 AD, Theodosius received unthinkable news. A Gothic army led by Alaric had besieged Rome 3 times and finally burst over its walls, sacking the city. While the sack was relatively constrained, it shocked the world. Writer Saint Melania described the horrifying event. A barbarian storm fell upon Rome, not even sparing bronze forum statues, destroying everything with barbarian madness. Thus Rome, beautified for 200 years, became a ruin. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote passionately, "O horror! The universe tumbles, yet our sins don't fall. A renowned city, head of the Roman Empire, is consumed in one blaze." The disaster sent refugees fleeing across the Mediterranean. Saint Jerome described their desperate plight. Who would believe mighty Rome would be reduced to such extremities as to need shelter, food, and clothing? Some are so cruel that instead of showing compassion, they break up captives' rags expecting to find gold. Theodosius was determined Constantinople wouldn't follow Rome's fate. The walls he built would be one of history's most imposing defensive structures. 3 walls arranged one after another, each taller than the last, with a wide moat in front. This moat could be instantly flooded using an ingenious pipe system running along the walls. The final wall was almost 5 meters thick and 12 meters high, including 96 towers, each 20 meters tall. Built with precisely cut white limestone and decorated with red brick lines, they gleamed white in sunlight. These walls were so formidable they wouldn't be breached for 1,000 years. It would take a complete military technology revolution to breach them. These walls weren't completed a moment too soon. As final stones were placed, they would face one of the most fearsome tests imaginable. The force driving nomadic migrations had become apparent. A people known as the Huns, soon ruled by a man whose shadow would loom over all Europe. His predecessors had united Russian steppe nomads into a terrifying force. He would lead them west in a destruction campaign with few equals. That man's name was Attila. The Huns were nomadic warriors from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe, living mostly from herded animal meat and milk. Initially, they stayed away from Roman territory. Romans even hired them as mercenaries. With Attila's rise, everything changed. Byzantine historian Priscus described Attila, a man born to shake nations, the scourge of all lands, who terrified mankind. He was hardy in walk, rolling his eyes so that his proud spirit's power appeared in his body's movement. He was indeed a lover of war. When Attila became Hun king, he set out on aggressive Roman expansion. He broke former treaties and began raiding cities. The weakened Roman army could do little to repel him. Attila conquered territory throughout Gaul into modern France, establishing a vast Hunnic empire across Eastern and Central Europe. In 447, he marched across the Danube into the Eastern Roman Empire. Eastern Romans were immediately overwhelmed. Border forts burned, pillars of black smoke rising skyward. Now Attila's armies bore down on their world's center, Constantinople itself, and those legendary walls were about to face their ultimate test. But here's where things get absolutely wild. While Attila was busy terrorizing half of Europe, Mother Nature decided to throw her own tantrum at the worst possible moment. Constantinople had survived countless sieges, political disasters, and economic crashes. But what happened next makes every other Byzantine crisis look like a minor inconvenience. The ground beneath the greatest city in the world started shaking like a washing machine on steroids. January 447 AD. The earth didn't just tremble, it went completely berserk. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled like sandcastles. The city's famous skyline, once a symbol of Roman engineering mastery, became a jagged mess of broken roofs and collapsed walls. People were buried alive in the rubble. Entire neighborhoods vanished under tons of stone and timber, the screams echoing through the streets mixed with the horrible groaning of more buildings about to fall. But the real nightmare, the legendary Theodosian walls, those massive fortifications that had protected Constantinople for decades, came crashing down in huge sections. Imagine the terror. The one thing standing between you and Attila's bloodthirsty army just got demolished by an earthquake. It's like your front door getting ripped off right as a gang of murderous Vikings shows up at your house. The Byzantine historian Kalin Akos wasn't exaggerating when he wrote about the chaos. Over 100 cities across Thrace got completely destroyed. The death toll was so massive they stopped counting bodies. Churches became graveyards. Monasteries turned into ruins filled with the corpses of monks and nuns who'd been caught in the collapse. The earthquakes didn't stop after the first devastating hit. For 4 solid months, the ground kept shaking. Each new tremor brought down more buildings, triggered more floods, and killed more people. It was like the earth itself had declared war on the Eastern Roman Empire. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't just random disasters, they felt like divine punishment. Citizens who'd grown up believing Constantinople was divinely protected, that its walls were unbreachable, suddenly found themselves staring at massive gaps in their defenses. The timing couldn't have been worse. Reports were flooding in from the north about Attila's army getting closer every day. Hun cavalry had been spotted just days away from the city. Their advanced scouts were probably already seeing the smoke rising from Constantinople's ruins. And Attila? He was probably laughing his barbaric head off when news reached him. The earthquake had done half his job for him. The great walls that had stopped every other barbarian army in history were now piles of rubble. His path to the richest city in the world was wide open. But here's where the Byzantine spirit kicks in. That stubborn refusal to just roll over and die that would define their empire for the next 1,000 years. Enter Constantinus, a government official from the lands of Phrygia in modern-day Turkey, who just got handed the most impossible job in imperial history. Fix the walls before Attila arrives. Oh, and you've got maybe 2 months. Good luck. Most people would have packed their bags and fled to Egypt. Constantinus had a different idea, one so crazy it just might work. He knew Constantinople had one massive untapped resource that no other city in the world possessed: the most competitive, passionate, and violently dedicated sports fans in human history. He walked into Constantinople's massive hippodrome, where 60,000 screaming fans regularly watched chariot races that made modern football riots look like tea parties. This wasn't just entertainment, it was organized warfare disguised as sport. The blues, greens, reds, and whites. Each team had thousands of hardcore supporters who'd literally kill for their colors. These weren't casual fans who showed up for big games. These were full-time fanatics whose entire identity revolved around their team. Each racing faction was tied to political parties in the Byzantine Senate. They had their own neighborhoods, their own meeting halls, their own unofficial armies. Fights between rival fans were so common that the city had permanent graveyards just for people killed in sports riots. The hippodrome wasn't just a racetrack, it was the social and political heart of Constantinople. More decisions affecting the empire were made in those stands than in the Senate House. If you wanted to understand Byzantine politics, you watched the chariot races. Constantinus looked at this sea of violent sports fanatics and saw something nobody else did. The largest, most motivated construction crew in the known world. His announcement was brilliant in its simplicity. The city was in mortal danger. Each racing team would get their own section of wall to rebuild. Winner gets bragging rights forever. Losers get to explain to their grandchildren why they let their team down when it mattered most. But he sweetened the deal even more. The winning team wouldn't just get glory, they'd get permanent honors in the hippodrome. Their section of wall would be marked with their colors. Future generations would see their team's handiwork every time they looked at Constantinople's defenses. The response was electric. These gang members scattered across Constantinople like recruiters on a mission from God. They hit every tavern, bathhouse, spice market, and street corner in the city. The pitch was irresistible. Your team's honor is on the line. And oh yeah, if we lose, we all die horribly under Hun axes. Within days, over 16,000 workers were hauling stone and mortar up scaffolding. But these weren't just random volunteers. Each team brought their own expertise. The Blues recruited heavily from the docks, bringing stevedores and sailors who knew how to move heavy materials. The Greens focused on craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers. The Reds went for numbers, pulling in everyone from bakers to street sweepers. The Whites targeted the wealthy districts, convincing merchants to not just work, but fund better tools and materials. Picture the scene. Thousands of people working around the clock, racing against time and each other. The Blues trying to outbuild the Greens. The Reds showing off with fancy stonework. The Whites going for speed over style. It was like the world's most important construction competition, with death as the prize for last place. The energy was absolutely insane. These weren't professional builders. They were bakers, merchants, dock workers, and street vendors who'd never touched a trowel in their lives, but they were working for something bigger than themselves. Women joined in too, carrying water and food to the workers, organizing supply chains, even helping with lighter construction tasks. Children ran messages between different sections of wall. Old men who couldn't lift stones acted as supervisors and quality control. The team's songs were legendary. Each faction had their traditional chants, but new songs emerged during the wall building. Epic ballads about racing against death, hymns praising their team's superior masonry skills, and absolutely savage insults directed at rival teams' construction techniques. The Blues would sing about their walls being as solid as their racing victories. The Greens responded with songs mocking blue stonework as sloppy as their chariot driving. The Reds and Whites got into musical battles over who was laying mortar faster. But underneath all the competition was genuine terror. Everyone knew what happened when Attila conquered a city. The stories from Gaul and Germania were horrifying. Entire populations enslaved or massacred, cities burned to the ground, cultural treasures destroyed forever. This wasn't just about team pride, it was about survival. Every stone placed, every section of wall completed was another barrier between their families and the most feared army in the world. The work organization was surprisingly sophisticated. Teams developed their own supply chains, bringing materials from quarries outside the city. They established work shifts so construction continued around the clock. They even created a primitive quality control system where rival teams inspected each other's work. The competition drove innovation. Teams developed new techniques for moving heavy stones, better mortar recipes, more efficient scaffolding systems. Some of these innovations would be used in Constantinople's construction projects for centuries. In just 2 months, they didn't just rebuild the walls, they made them stronger than before. The new sections were actually more advanced than the original Theodosian construction. The earthquake had forced them to rebuild with better materials and improved techniques. The inscription carved into the base tells the whole story. By command of Theodosius, in less than 2 months, Constantinus erected triumphantly these strong walls. Scarcely could Pallas have built so quickly so strong a citadel. They were comparing their work to Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. That's not just confidence, that's divine-level bragging. Now imagine Attila's face when he finally reached Constantinople, expecting to find earthquake ruins and easy pickings. Instead, he's staring at a triple line of defensive walls, limestone gleaming white in the sun, stronger than anything he'd ever seen. The man who'd terrorized half of Europe, who'd made emperors wet themselves in fear, just got schooled by a bunch of sports fans with hammers and determination. The psychological impact on Attila's army must have been devastating. They'd marched hundreds of miles expecting to loot the richest city in the world. Instead, they found walls that looked impossible to breach, defended by a population that had just proven they could accomplish miracles when their backs were against the wall. The stalemate that followed was almost anticlimactic. Attila couldn't break the walls. The Byzantines couldn't beat his army in open battle. Both sides settled in for what could have been a very long siege. But Attila had a problem. His army was massive, probably over 100,000 men. Feeding that many soldiers while camped outside impregnable walls was a logistical nightmare. Every day he waited, his supplies dwindled, and his men grew more restless. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were safely inside their city with access to the sea. Ships could bring in food and supplies while Attila's army slowly starved. Time was on Constantinople's side, so they did what civilized people do. They threw money at the problem until it went away. The treaty was expensive but effective. The Byzantines agreed to increase their annual tribute payments to the Huns from £700 of gold to £2,100. That's roughly 3 tons of gold per year in modern terms. But here's the thing. Constantinople could afford it. The city's trade networks generated enormous wealth. 3 tons of gold was expensive but manageable, especially compared to the cost of rebuilding after a Hun sack. Attila took his tribute and left Byzantine territory, probably muttering about earthquakes and crazy Romans who turned disasters into construction projects. Constantinople was saved. The Eastern Roman Empire would survive to fight another day. But while the East was busy proving that sports fans make excellent emergency workers, the Western Roman Empire was falling apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. The geography tells the whole story of why one half lived while the other died. Byzantine lands stretched across 2 continents with every climate you can imagine. These territories had always been the richest, most populated parts of the old Roman Empire. By the late Empire, the East had 3 times the budget of the West and double the army size. That's like having a business where one branch is making millions while the other is selling lemonade on street corners. The wealth disparity wasn't accidental. It came from geography, trade routes, and population density. The Eastern Mediterranean had been the center of ancient civilization for thousands of years. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople were massive commercial hubs with trade connections stretching from India to Britain. In Europe, the heart of Byzantine power was the Balkans, modern Greece, Albania, Macedonia, Bulgaria. Craggy mountains covered in dense forests created natural fortress valleys that drained into 3 different seas. Perfect defensive terrain that made invasion extremely difficult. The mountain passes could be easily defended by small forces. The forests provided cover for guerrilla warfare. The coastline offered multiple escape routes if land defenses failed. It was like having a continent-sized castle with built-in moats. The most fertile regions stretched along the Danube, Europe's second longest river. This massive waterway provided transportation, irrigation, and natural defense. Cities along the Danube became wealthy trading centers connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean. The northern areas had climates similar to modern Germany and France. Coastal regions produced grains, vegetables, and fruit trees, apples, cherries, figs, pears, pomegranates. The agricultural diversity meant famines were rare. If one crop failed, others could compensate. Olive trees thrived in the rocky soil, providing oil for cooking, lighting, and trade. Inland valleys were terraced with vineyards and orchards. The wine industry was so successful that Byzantine wines were exported throughout the known world. Higher mountain regions were perfect for herding goats and sheep. The animals provided meat, milk, wool, and leather. Shepherds developed sophisticated techniques for managing large herds across difficult terrain. It was like having a medieval supermarket that stretched for thousands of miles with natural defenses that made it nearly impossible to conquer. Across the narrow Bosphorus Channel lay Anatolia, roughly modern Turkey. Western regions rose gently from the Aegean Sea into fertile coastal plains where ancient Greeks had founded their city-states centuries earlier. These coastal areas were incredibly productive. The soil was rich, the climate was perfect for agriculture, and natural harbors provided easy access to maritime trade routes. Cities like Ephesus and Smyrna became some of the wealthiest in the ancient world. But towering mountains dominated the north and south, including the massive Taurus Range. These peaks formed an almost unbroken wall along southern Turkey, broken only by the famous Cilician Gates, a narrow gorge that took ancient travelers 5 days to cross. The Cilician Gates were one of the most strategically important locations in the ancient world. Anyone wanting to move armies or trade goods between Anatolia and Syria had to pass through this bottleneck. Controlling the gates meant controlling trade between Asia and Europe. Much of central Anatolia wasn't great for crops, but the sloping plateaus were perfect for vast pastures. Medieval writers regularly mentioned the enormous herds of cattle, goats, and sheep that roamed these highlands. The pastoral economy was incredibly sophisticated. Nomadic tribes moved their herds seasonally between summer and winter grazing areas. They developed complex systems for managing breeding, disease control, and predator protection. The wealth generated by these herds was enormous. Wool from Anatolian sheep was considered the finest in the world. Leather products were exported throughout Europe and Asia. The dairy industry produced cheeses that were luxury items in Constantinople's markets. Despite being administratively divided, Romans in both halves still saw themselves as one empire with 2 capitals. But the cultural differences were huge and growing larger every year. The East was overwhelmingly Greek. Everyone spoke Greek throughout the empire's history, unlike Western Rome with its Latin. But the Greek spoken in Byzantium wasn't the classical Greek of ancient Athens. It was a living, evolving language that incorporated Latin, Slavic, and Turkish influences. The religious differences were equally significant. While both halves were Christian, they developed different theological traditions. The East became increasingly focused on mystical and contemplative practices. Monasticism flourished in ways that would have seemed strange to Western Christians. But here's the weird part. Byzantines never called themselves Greek. The word Greek had negative connotations in the Roman world, associated with weakness and effeminacy. They called themselves Romans, always. For over 1,000 years, right until the end, they insisted they were the real Romans. The Western Empire had fallen, but the Roman Empire continued in Constantinople. Call a Byzantine emperor emperor of the Greeks, and you just committed a major insult. You were essentially saying he was a pretender, not the legitimate heir to Augustus and Trajan. This wasn't just political posturing. Byzantines genuinely believed they were continuing the Roman tradition in its purest form. They had Roman law, Roman administrative systems, Roman military traditions. The fact that they spoke Greek didn't make them any less Roman in their minds. The Byzantine philosopher Themistius put it perfectly when talking about Constantinople and Rome as the world's two mother cities. Though he argued Constantinople deserved more credit since it had built itself from nothing and still became Rome's equal partner through pure virtue, this comparison wasn't entirely fair. Constantinople had been founded by Constantine as a new Rome with massive imperial resources. The city was built using wealth from across the entire empire. It didn't exactly start from nothing, but the point stands. By the 5th century, Constantinople had become the more important of the two cities. It was larger, wealthier, and more powerful than its namesake in Italy. Archbishop Gregory of Nazianzus captured the relationship beautifully in 381 AD. Nature has not given us two suns, but it has given two Romes, beacons of the whole world. One ancient power and one new, differing only in that one outshines the sun, the other the evening star. The metaphor was prophetic. Rome was the evening star, still visible but fading. Constantinople was the sun, rising to illuminate the world. So imagine being a citizen of Constantinople in the 470s, hearing stories about what was happening in the West. Your sister city, one of the two mother cities of the world, was dying a slow, humiliating death. The reports coming from Italy were increasingly desperate. Rome had been sacked twice in living memory, first by Alaric in 410, then by the Vandals in 455. Each sack had been more devastating than the last. The psychological impact was enormous. Rome was supposed to be eternal. It was the city that had conquered the world, that had created the greatest empire in human history. Seeing it reduced to a target for barbarian raids was like watching a god die. But the physical damage was even worse. Rome's population had been hemorrhaging for decades. The great families that had run the empire for centuries were fleeing to their country estates or emigrating to Constantinople. The city's infrastructure was collapsing. Aqueducts weren't maintained. Roads were full of potholes. Public buildings were abandoned. The forums that had once been the center of world civilization were becoming marketplaces for local farmers. Its wealth was gone. The tribute that had once flowed to Rome from across the empire had dried up. The complex trade networks that had made Roman merchants rich were broken. The city that had once ruled the Mediterranean was becoming a regional Italian town. Its influence barely extended beyond the Italian peninsula. Provinces that had been loyal to Rome for centuries were now making their own arrangements with local strongmen. The Western Roman Empire was fragmenting into dozens of competing kingdoms. The decline was literally written in stone. The massive Basilica Aemilia, next to the Senate House, burned down during one of the sacks. Romans rebuilt the exterior facade to look grand for visitors, but never bothered fixing the interior. It was a perfect metaphor, a grand face hiding a burned-out shell. Rome was trying to maintain appearances while everything behind the facade was ruined. Archaeological evidence shows the brutal reality. By the mid-5th century, people were dumping garbage inside Rome's great monuments. Buildings were crumbling. Rough paths were being cut through fine gardens by people dragging carts and horses wherever they needed to go. The famous Roman roads weren't maintained, bridges collapsed, harbors silted up. The engineering marvels that had once connected the empire were becoming obstacles to travel and trade. The Roman emperor in the west, ruling from Ravenna, had become little more than an Italian warlord. He controlled maybe a third of Italy on a good day. The rest of his supposed empire was run by Germanic kingdoms that acknowledged his authority when it was convenient. Rome couldn't pay its legions anymore and relied increasingly on German mercenaries. But the mercenaries were expensive, unreliable, and had their own political agendas. They were as likely to rebel against Rome as fight for it. The financial situation was hopeless. The Western Empire's tax base had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. The wealthy had found ways to avoid taxation. The middle class was extinct. The poor had nothing left to give. Eventually, they couldn't pay the mercenaries either. When one group called the Heruli demanded Italian lands as payment and the Romans refused, the Heruli rebelled. They weren't asking for much, just farms and villages to settle their families. But even that was too much for the bankrupt Western Empire. The remaining Roman army was crushed at the Battle of Ravenna in 476 AD. It wasn't even a real battle, more like a massacre. The Roman forces were so outnumbered and demoralized that most of them fled before the fighting started. The Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was forced to resign. He was just a teenager who'd been put on the throne by his father. When the Germans showed up, there was nobody left willing to fight for him. The Western Empire vanished as a political entity entirely. One day there was a Roman emperor in the West. The next day there wasn't. 1,000 years of history ended with a whimper, not a bang. For Easterners watching this collapse over decades, it must have been terrifying. As St. Jerome wrote, "What is safe if Rome perishes?" If the eternal city could fall, if the empire that had conquered the world could simply disappear, what hope did anyone have for survival? But life in the East was virtually unaffected. In fact, Constantinople kept growing in importance, becoming the undisputed capital of the Mediterranean world. The East became a safe haven for refugees fleeing Western destruction. Ships arriving from Italy were packed with aristocrats, merchants, scholars, and craftsmen who'd lost everything in the barbarian conquests. Paulinus of Pella considered leaving the West for his Byzantine estates in Greece and Albania. His wife convinced him the journey was too dangerous, but many others made the trip successfully. These refugees brought skills, knowledge, and connections that enriched Byzantine society. They also brought first-hand accounts of the Western collapse that motivated Easterners to strengthen their own defenses. This began Constantinople's role as sanctuary for the desperate, what later poets called beloved refuge for strangers, queen of the queens of cities, song of songs, and splendor of splendors. The city's reputation as a safe haven attracted immigrants from across the known world. Constantinople became one of the most cosmopolitan cities in history, with neighborhoods dedicated to specific ethnic communities. The fall of Rome posed a serious religious crisis for Eastern Christians. The empire had converted to Christianity barely a century earlier under Constantine. Many saw the conversion as proof of divine favor. Now destruction was raining down from all sides. If Christianity was the true faith, why was the Christian empire collapsing? Had God abandoned Rome? Were the old pagan gods taking revenge? Many in Rome believed this was punishment for abandoning the old pagan gods. Some aristocrats secretly returned to pagan practices, hoping to appease the ancient deities. Eastern Christian scholars argued the opposite, that remaining pagan practices had brought the collapse. They claimed Rome's fall was divine punishment for not being Christian enough. As the writer Nilus put it, earthquakes and conflagrations and all other grievous things are occurring for no other reason than the wickedness of superstitious men among you who continue to sacrifice to worthless deities. This theological debate would continue for centuries. Eastern Christianity developed a more triumphant, confident tone. They were the true heirs of the Roman Empire because they had remained faithful to God. The Eastern Empire survived the 5th century's chaos remarkably well. It suffered some damage from Hun and Ostrogoth invasions, but ultimately bought off these attackers. Money was cheaper than war, and the Byzantines had plenty of money. Vandal pirates from North Africa were annoying, raiding coastal cities and disrupting trade routes, but they couldn't threaten Constantinople itself. The Byzantine navy was strong enough to protect the capital and major ports. Nomadic tribes like the Blemis and Nobatae caused trouble in Upper Egypt, but these were frontier problems that didn't threaten the empire's core territories. Nothing inflicted permanent damage. The Eastern Empire's defensive strategy was working. They traded space for time, money for peace, and diplomacy for military victory. Soon, one man would launch an ambitious crusade to recover the fragmented Western lands. He was one of history's most remarkable and controversial characters. His name was Justinian. But Justinian's story begins with his uncle Justin, a perfect example of Byzantine society's incredible social mobility. In Byzantium, anyone could rise through the ranks to reach imperial power, regardless of their birth. This wasn't theoretical. It actually happened regularly. Farmers became generals, soldiers became senators, merchants became emperors. The Byzantine system rewarded talent and ambition over aristocratic birth. Justin started life as a swineherd in mountainous Dardania, in the region next to Macedonia. His family were peasants who raised pigs for local markets. It was honest work, but not exactly a path to imperial glory. As a teenager, he and 2 friends fled the Western chaos that was consuming the Balkans. Barbarian raids were becoming more frequent and more destructive. Young men faced a choice: join the raiders, become victims, or flee to safety. They chose flight, crossing dangerous mountain passes with columns of refugees, smoke from their burning homeland rising behind them. Everyone in that column had one destination, the only place that seemed safe in a collapsing world: Constantinople, the refuge of strangers. The journey was incredibly dangerous. Mountain passes were controlled by bandits who preyed on refugees. Wild animals were a constant threat. Food and water were scarce. Many refugees died along the way. Procopius described their humble journey. 3 young farmers came from Dardania determined to join the army. They covered the whole distance to Byzantium on foot, carrying on their shoulders cloaks in which they had nothing but twice-baked bread. That's it. 3 teenagers with the clothes on their backs and some stale bread, walking hundreds of miles to reach the imperial capital. Life in the capital was brutal at first. Justin spoke only basic Greek and was completely illiterate. He had no connections, no money, no skills except farming. He was one of thousands of refugees competing for the few jobs available to outsiders. But he had 2 advantages. He was physically strong and absolutely determined to succeed. He managed to secure a place in the palace guard, probably through sheer persistence and willingness to do jobs that others avoided. The palace guard was dangerous work. Guards faced constant threats from assassins, poisoners, and political conspirators. The pay was low and the hours were long, but it was a foot in the door of the imperial system. Justin proved himself reliable and loyal. He rose through military ranks to become tribune, then senator, and finally commander of the palace guard under Emperor Anastasius. Each promotion brought new responsibilities and new dangers. Palace politics were incredibly complex and murderous. One wrong move could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. But Justin navigated these waters successfully. He learned to read people, to form alliances, to avoid making enemies. His peasant background actually helped. He wasn't threatening to the established aristocracy because he had no family connections or inherited wealth. When Emperor Anastasius died in 518, the palace exploded in typical Byzantine intrigue. Multiple factions competed for control of the throne. Bribes were offered, threats were made, and alliances shifted daily. Grand Chamberlain Amantius, one of the most powerful men in the empire, gave Justin a large amount of money to buy his support for a candidate named Theocritus. But Justin took the cash and distributed it to numerous other people, securing their loyalty for himself instead. It was a brilliant move that showed real political intelligence. When the dust settled, Justin was emperor. The illiterate peasant from Dardania had reached the very pinnacle of Roman power. Justin immediately reached out to his family back home and brought his young nephew Justinian to Constantinople for education. Justinian was also a peasant, but in Constantinople he received the finest education available in the ancient world. He learned jurisprudence, the complex legal system that governed the empire. He studied theology, the Christian doctrines that were reshaping Roman society. He absorbed Roman history, the stories of great emperors and their achievements. Most importantly, he learned about the empire that once ruled the West and the circumstances of its catastrophic fall. He studied maps showing the territories that had been lost. He read reports about barbarian kingdoms ruling former Roman lands. Perhaps here he began dreaming of his seemingly impossible project, the Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. When Justinian became emperor, after Justin's death in 527, he set about ruling with enormous energy and ambition. He became known as the emperor who never sleeps, because he worked around the clock on imperial business. His work schedule was legendary. He would start before dawn reading reports from across the empire. He personally reviewed major legal cases, military appointments, and diplomatic correspondence. He met with generals, bishops, merchants, and foreign ambassadors. But his reign was controversial from the very beginning. He married Theodora, a lower-class woman with a scandalous past as an actress and courtesan. This caused outrage across the empire's traditional aristocracy. In Byzantine society, marriage was supposed to reflect and reinforce social hierarchies. Emperors married into established noble families to strengthen political alliances. Justinian's choice of Theodora violated every social convention. The scandal was made worse by Theodora's reputation. Actresses in the ancient world were generally assumed to be prostitutes. Theodora had performed in sexually explicit theatrical productions. She'd had multiple lovers before meeting Justinian. Yet Justinian not only married her, but made her his co-ruler. Theodora appeared on coins, issued her own edicts, and received foreign ambassadors. She was arguably the most powerful woman in Roman history. The scholar Procopius shows these contradictions perfectly. Early in his career, he portrayed Justinian and Theodora as a pious, dedicated couple working together to restore Roman greatness. Later, he wrote a secret tell-all called The Anecdotes, a scandalous exposé of the true imperial couple that couldn't be published during their lifetimes. In his secret history, Procopius portrays Justinian as a cruel, incompetent ruler who committed numberless murders through his notion of piety and recklessly murdered all who dissented from his Christian doctrine. He describes Theodora as a power-hungry manipulator who used her sexuality to control the emperor and advance her own agenda. According to Procopius, she was responsible for countless executions, confiscations, and political persecutions. Procopius even claimed the imperial couple were possessed by evil spirits, recounting tales of them wandering the palace without heads. The emperor suddenly rose from his throne and walked about, and Justinian's head vanished while the rest of his body seemed to ebb and flow. Whether any of this was true, we'll never know. Procopius was writing in secret, with no fact-checkers or editors. He may have been settling personal scores or repeating court gossip. What's certain is that Justinian was incredibly ambitious and willing to use extreme methods to achieve his goals. In 532, those same chariot racing factions that had rebuilt the walls against Attila joined forces to riot against Justinian's rule. The Blues and Greens put aside their ancient rivalry to march together through Constantinople. They were protesting against high taxes, religious persecution, and what they saw as corruption in Justinian's administration. The rioters set fires throughout the city and chanted Nika, Nika, the Greek word for victory. The Nika riots were so severe that Justinian considered fleeing by sea. His advisors had boats ready at the imperial harbour. For several days it looked like the emperor might be overthrown by the same sports fans who had once saved the city. The old church of Hagia Sophia that had stood beside the imperial palace since Constantine's time burned to the ground in the rioting. Centuries of imperial history went up in smoke. Justinian's response was brutal and decisive. He ordered his generals Belisarius and Mundus to crush the riots with military force. The palace guards and foreign mercenaries were unleashed on the crowds. Procopius records that 30,000 citizens of Constantinople were killed during the repression. The hippodrome's sands were literally stained with blood as soldiers massacred rioters trapped in the arena. The numbers may be exaggerated, but the violence was real. Justinian had chosen to rule through fear rather than popularity. He would be obeyed, or he would be deadly. In the wake of this violence, Justinian resolved to rebuild the city in a way that would demonstrate his power and divine favor. In the blackened ruins of the old Hagia Sophia, he ordered plans for a new cathedral that would surpass every other building in the world. The project was staggeringly ambitious. Justinian wanted to create a building that would make visitors fall to their knees in awe. It would be larger than St. Peter's in Rome, more beautiful than any pagan temple, more impressive than any royal palace. The result was one of the world's most remarkable buildings. Columns and marbles came from across the empire and beyond, porphyry from Egypt, marble from Proconnesus, granite from Asia Minor. The best craftsmen from every province were brought to Constantinople. More than 10,000 people worked on construction over 5 years. The cost was enormous, roughly 145 tons of gold in modern terms. That's about $8 billion in today's money. The engineering was revolutionary. The vast dome rises 55 meters above the ground with a 30-meter span. At the time, it was the largest enclosed space ever built. The architectural techniques used to support that dome weren't fully understood until the 20th century. This is the Church of St. Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, today one of the world's most recognizable landmarks and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But Justinian's ambitions extended far beyond architecture. He was determined to increase his empire's economic potential and break the monopolies that limited Byzantine trade. One of the most profitable goods in the ancient world was silk. Chinese silk was worth more than gold in European markets, but the Chinese closely guarded the secrets of silk production, and Byzantine merchants had to pay enormous markups to middlemen. Justinian decided to change that through perhaps history's first act of corporate espionage, stealing the secret of silk production from China itself. And that, as they say, is where our story takes another completely unexpected turn into the world of ancient spies, smuggled silkworms, and economic warfare that would reshape the global economy. The engineering behind Justinian's crown jewel was absolutely mind-blowing. The massive dome soared 55 meters into the sky with a 30-meter span that defied everything architects thought was possible. At the time, this was the largest enclosed space humanity had ever built. The techniques used to keep that dome from crashing down weren't even fully understood until the 20th century rolled around. This masterpiece was the Church of St. Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, and today it stands as one of the world's most jaw-dropping landmarks and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But here's the thing about Justinian. Building the most spectacular church in history was just his warm-up act. His real ambitions were far more devious and incredibly profitable. He was dead set on breaking the trade monopolies that were bleeding his empire dry and turning Byzantium into the economic powerhouse it deserved to be. See, one of the most insanely profitable goods in the ancient world was silk. Chinese silk was literally worth more than gold in European markets. We're talking about fabric so valuable that wars were fought over trade routes. But the Chinese had locked down silk production secrets tighter than a maximum security prison. Byzantine merchants were getting absolutely destroyed by middlemen who were charging markups that would make modern pharmaceutical companies blush. Justinian looked at this situation and basically said, "Not on my watch." He decided to pull off what was probably his first major act of corporate espionage, stealing the secret of silk production straight from China itself. Now in the year 551, two Byzantine monks who had been casually preaching in India stumbled upon something that would change the world forever. They watched, completely mesmerized, as Chinese workers carefully raised these tiny creatures called silkworms and somehow spun their cocoons into the most incredible fabric anyone had ever seen. These weren't your average missionaries anymore. They'd just discovered the source of the miracle material that was making China ridiculously wealthy. Racing back to Constantinople like their lives depended on it, they burst into the imperial palace demanding an urgent audience with Emperor Justinian himself. "Your Majesty," they probably said, still catching their breath from their journey, "we've found it. We've actually found the secret behind silk." Justinian's reaction was probably like watching someone win the lottery and discover they're related to royalty on the same day. This was even just bigger than any military victory. This was the economic breakthrough that could transform his entire empire overnight. He offered these monks a fortune so massive it would make today's tech billionaires look middle class if they could somehow smuggle these mysterious worms back to the capital. What happened next was basically the ancient world's version of Mission Impossible. These monks transformed from holy men into international super spies, setting out on what had to be the most dangerous and valuable shopping trip in human history. They probably took the northern route along the Black Sea, a journey that would make modern extreme adventurers look like they were taking a casual stroll through the park. We're talking about thousands of miles through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They trudged through the Tarim Basin, somehow survived crossing the Taklamakan Desert, a hellscape so dangerous that its name literally translates to "go in and you won't come out," passed through the legendary Gate of Jade and descended the treacherous Hexi corridor into the very heart of China. But here's where these monks proved they were absolute geniuses. They carried specially prepared bamboo canes that had been hollowed out and fitted with secret compartments. In China, they somehow convinced locals to help them smuggle out silkworms, probably in the form of eggs or tiny larvae, since adult silkworms are basically the drama queens of the insect world who will die if you breathe on them wrong. This entire covert operation took up to 2 years. 2 full years of dodging Chinese border patrols, surviving sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone, navigating political intrigue, and somehow keeping these incredibly delicate creatures alive while traveling thousands of miles across some of the most unforgiving landscapes on the planet. When they finally made it back to Constantinople, they weren't just carrying a few insects, they were smuggling the keys to economic domination. The impact was immediate and absolutely devastating to China's silk monopoly. Silk production facilities started popping up across the Byzantine Empire like mushrooms after rain. Constantinople became the center of European silk production practically overnight. Beirut, Antioch, and Thebes all jumped on the silk bandwagon. The Byzantine Empire had just executed the ultimate economic power play, establishing their own silk monopoly in Europe, while the Chinese were probably still figuring out how their state secrets had walked out the door. The money started flowing into Byzantine coffers like a golden tsunami. By the early 6th century, Constantinople had transformed into the undisputed heavyweight champion of European cities. They'd constructed the longest aqueduct system in the ancient world, engineering marvels that snaked for 250 kilometers through the countryside, making modern infrastructure projects look like amateur hour. They'd also built defensive fortifications that would make modern military planners weep with envy. The long walls stretched an incredible 56 kilometers from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, creating a defensive barrier more than 60 kilometers from the capital itself. But here's the thing about Emperor Justinian becoming fabulously wealthy and building the most secure city in the world still wasn't enough for this guy. He had dreams that were bigger than the most ambitious Hollywood blockbuster ever conceived. He wanted to rebuild the entire Western Roman Empire from the ground up, reclaiming every inch of territory that had been lost over the previous century. And the absolutely insane part, he was actually going to pull it off. Justinian was clever enough to recognize that he wasn't exactly cut out for personally leading cavalry charges and siege assaults. So he did what any smart CEO would do. He found himself the most talented general he could get his hands on. Enter Belisarius, a military genius who was about to rewrite the map of the Mediterranean world. From his throne in Constantinople, Justinian got to watch like he was commanding the world's most expensive and consequential strategy game, as his brilliant generals systematically conquered territory after territory, bringing the lands of the old Western Empire back under Roman control. Belisarius was basically a one-man wrecking crew with the tactical brilliance of Napoleon and the determination of a honey badger. He marched his armies across North Africa and completely annihilated the Vandal kingdom in just 9 months. That's barely enough time for most people to plan a wedding, and this guy conquered an entire civilization. Then he turned his attention to Italy, where an Ostrogothic king named Vitiges was still foolishly pretending he had any right to rule over Roman territory. The siege of Rome itself was like something ripped straight from an epic war movie, with Belisarius methodically surrounding the Eternal City and slowly tightening his grip like a python crushing its prey. For over a year, the siege dragged on, with both sides engaged in brutal urban warfare. Finally, in 536, Belisarius and his troops marched triumphantly through the gates of Rome as conquerors, reclaiming the city that had been the heart of civilization for 1,000 years. But here's the bittersweet reality about Rome in 536. It definitely wasn't the magnificent metropolis of Caesar's era anymore. 2 catastrophic earthquakes in the 5th century had reduced many of its greatest monuments to rubble. Still, the essential infrastructure was hanging on. Aqueducts were still delivering fresh water, the public baths were still operating, and believe it or not, gladiators and wild animals were still putting on shows in the Colosseum for whatever population remained. For Emperor Justinian and his general Belisarius, Rome represented the ultimate symbol of their revitalized empire, and they were prepared to defend it against absolutely anything. The Ostrogothic king Vitiges wasn't about to give up without a fight, though. He quickly assembled his own army and marched on Rome, turning the tables so that now it was Belisarius who found himself under siege. When Vitiges offered the Byzantine forces safe passage if they'd just pack up and leave the city in peace, Belisarius fired back with one of history's most badass responses. It was you who trespassed upon this city in former times, though it didn't belong to you at all. Now you've given it back, however unwillingly, to its ancient possessors. Anyone who thinks they're going to set foot in Rome without a fight is seriously mistaken, because as long as Belisarius lives, it's impossible for him to give up this city. The Romans ultimately succeeded in holding the city, but this victory was just the opening act of a long, brutal, and incredibly expensive series of wars that would drag on for years. Rome would be besieged and captured 3 more times over the following decades, each siege more devastating and costly than the last. But finally, the Ostrogothic grip on Italy completely collapsed, and the Byzantine Empire had successfully reclaimed the Eternal City for Rome. However, there was a tragic and deeply ironic twist to this whole situation that nobody saw coming. In their desperate effort to return Rome to the empire, the Byzantines had actually inflicted catastrophic damage on the very city they were trying to save. The wars of Belisarius were so brutal and destructive that historians estimate perhaps 90% of Rome's citizens were either killed outright or forced to flee the city, leaving behind a ghost town with a population of maybe 30,000 people. The inhabited area of the city shrank to just 1/10 of its previous size. Of the 13 magnificent aqueducts that had once carried fresh water directly into the heart of the city, only 2 were still functioning. If there had ever been any hope of Rome rebuilding the glory of its ancient past, the Byzantines had accidentally crushed that dream forever. And here's the really brutal irony: while Justinian's conquests were remarkable achievements that proved the Byzantine military could still dominate when properly led, they were also completely unsustainable. The empire simply didn't have the resources, manpower, or administrative capacity to maintain control over such a massive territory for any significant period of time. The Gothic Wars had drained the imperial treasury and distracted the military from other critical threats. Then in the 540s, another catastrophic plague spread throughout Europe, weakening the empire even further when it could least afford additional problems. This plague, known to history as the Plague of Justinian, was an absolute nightmare that may have killed anywhere between 25 to 100 million people over the next 2 centuries. Modern scientists have confirmed it was caused by a strain of Yersinia pestis, the exact same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death in medieval Europe. The outbreak in Constantinople is believed to have arrived via infected rats on grain ships coming from Egypt. Emperor Justinian himself reportedly contracted the disease, though he was fortunate enough to be among the roughly 50% of victims who actually survived. At its peak, the plague was killing an estimated 10,000 people every single day in Constantinople alone. The plague hit the Byzantine Empire at absolutely the worst possible moment, right when Justinian's armies had nearly succeeded in retaking all of Italy and the western Mediterranean coast. Soon after the plague struck, a Germanic people known as the Lombards invaded northern Italy, easily defeated the small Byzantine army that had been left there, and established their own kingdom. Just like that, the dream of resurrecting the ancient Roman Empire was dead. The 550s brought even more disasters. 2 major earthquakes shook Constantinople, and in what seemed like a devastating symbol of divine judgment, the Great Dome of the Hagia Sophia cracked in 558. A final earthquake caused the entire dome to collapse completely. To the citizens of Constantinople, this catastrophic event must have felt like God himself was passing final judgment on an emperor whose ambitions had reached too high and fallen too short. Justinian died in 565, having left no children to continue his dynasty. He was buried in a grand mausoleum in the Church of the Holy Apostles, and the emperors who followed him would spend decades dealing with the consequences of his overambitious conquests. Justinian had inherited an imperial treasury containing 29 million gold coins, but his endless wars had drained it almost completely dry. In the east, Byzantium now faced constant pressure from the powerful Sassanid Empire, a Persian empire that ruled from the city of Ctesiphon near modern Baghdad. Wars with the Sassanids dragged on for decades, weakening both empires and resulting in nothing but a bitter, expensive stalemate. By 630, the empire had lost most of Italy and North Africa once again, clinging to only a tiny foothold on the island of Sicily. But in the early 7th century, one emperor named Heraclius seemed like he might actually be able to return the empire to its previous glory. He ruled for 30 years, won an impressive series of military victories, and finally managed to beat the Sassanids back in Anatolia, even recapturing the holy city of Jerusalem. In 629, Heraclius brought the relic of the True Cross back to Jerusalem in a lavish and triumphant ceremony that must have felt like the empire was finally entering a new golden age. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the Byzantines had turned the corner and were headed back to greatness. But little did the people of Byzantium realize that a completely new rival was rising from one of the most unlikely places imaginable, the seemingly empty and worthless desert sands of Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula sits like a massive wedge of land, pinched between the Persian Gulf in the north and the Red Sea in the south. It's technically its own subcontinent, sitting on its own tectonic plate that has been slowly tearing away from Africa over millions of years, while gradually crashing into the Eurasian plate, creating Iran's impressive Zagros Mountains in the process. This is harsh, unforgiving country divided between rocky mountain ranges and dry coastal regions lined with coral reefs, separated by narrow strips of fertile pastures hidden in rocky valleys. But most famously, the region contains vast expanses of desert, including the Great Arabian Desert, the fifth largest desert in the world, and one of the deepest, with sand dunes that extend up to 180 meters below the surface. And it was here in this seemingly barren wasteland that a warrior visionary had risen to completely topple the established powers of the region and gather a military force that would shake the foundations of both the Byzantine and Persian empires. The man known to history as Muhammad was simultaneously a revolutionary, a guerrilla warfare genius, a poet, and an innovative military strategist. During the final 10 years of his life, he led a brilliantly successful campaign to capture the city of Mecca from the Quraysh tribe, who had controlled it for centuries. After his death in 632, his followers found themselves facing the lands of both the Sassanids in Mesopotamia and Persia, and the Byzantines in Egypt and Syria. But here's the thing, these two ancient superpowers had been completely hollowed out from within, weakened and bankrupted by their endless, pointless wars against each other. The last great war between the Byzantine and Persian empires had ended just a few years earlier, after grinding on for nearly 3 decades, leaving both civilizations critically weakened and vulnerable. The Arab advance came as a complete and total surprise to everyone involved. The Byzantines were so distracted by their ongoing conflicts that they paid almost no attention to news filtering across the desert from the south. They'd also made the critical mistake of stopping their tribute payments to desert tribes who usually provided them with intelligence about regional developments. In 634, the Arab armies shocked the entire world by defeating a Byzantine force sent into Syria and capturing Damascus in a lightning-fast strike that nobody saw coming. The Byzantines tried to mount a counterattack in 636, but a massive sandstorm scattered their forces just as Arab cavalry descended on them like wolves, resulting in their complete annihilation. Arab armies fought with swords forged from the finest Indian steel, riding on camels and horses that were perfectly adapted to desert warfare. Their tactics were primarily defensive, using their superior mobility to lure opponents into poorly planned attacks, while positioned archers on both flanks picked them apart. The Byzantines' only hope was that their ancient rivals, the Sassanids, would somehow manage to halt the Arab advance from the east. But this hope was completely in vain. Arab attacks would actually bring about the total disintegration and collapse of the Sassanid Empire. 400 years later, the Persian poet Ferdowsi would write this haunting lament about the end of that great power. Damn this world, damn this time, damn this fate. Where are your valiant warriors and priests? Where are your hunting parties and your feasts? Where is that warlike spirit, and where are those great armies that destroyed our country's foes? count on us as ruins, as the lair of lions and leopards. Look now and despair." The Byzantines could only watch helplessly as their Asian territories were systematically swallowed up by Arab conquest. Jerusalem, recaptured less than a decade earlier, at enormous cost in blood and treasure, surrendered to Arab armies in 637 for Emperor Heraclius, on whom the Byzantines had pinned all their hopes for revival. This catastrophic defeat proved to be too much to bear. He had once been the commander of his father's fleet, a bold and accomplished sailor who had seemed afraid of nothing. But in his old age he developed an overwhelming case of thalassophobia, an irrational but paralyzing fear of the sea. On his way back to Constantinople from Asia, he found even the 700-meter crossing of the Bosphorus too terrifying to attempt normally. His men had to tie boats together across the entire length of the crossing and cover them with shrubs and matting so the terrified old emperor could not see the dark water rocking ominously beneath him. When Egypt fell to Arab forces in 642, the Byzantine Empire lost its primary source of grain, an arrangement that had been in place since the time of the ancient Romans. The entire economic structure of the empire had to be completely reorganized overnight, adding severe food shortages to the growing list of existential problems facing Constantinople. By 647, the last Byzantine territory in Africa, the ancient and once mighty city of Carthage, had also fallen to the advancing Arab armies. Then in 644, the Byzantines witnessed something that filled them with absolute horror. The Arab Empire began building a navy. Only a decade later, this new Arab fleet was strong enough to raid Cyprus and Rhodes. Neither island could offer even token resistance, and it quickly became obvious that Byzantium was no longer capable of defending its far-flung territories. In 654, Emperor Constans personally took command of the Byzantine navy, the pride of the empire, and supposedly its last line of defense, to meet the Arab fleet in what would be a decisive naval battle. The Byzantine writer, Theophanes the Confessor, recorded what happened next. "While we are commanded that a great naval armament should be made to sail against Constantinople." This force arrived at Phoenix in Lycia, where Emperor Constans was waiting with the Roman fleet, and engaged him in a sea battle. The emperor, who had taken no measures to properly organize his battle line, ordered the Roman fleet to attack. When the two sides engaged, the Romans were completely defeated, and the sea was literally dyed red with Roman blood. In the aftermath, 500 Byzantine ships were destroyed. Emperor Constans was forced to swap clothes with another man and flee disguised as a common soldier. A humiliation so stinging it must have felt like the end of the world. The man who had taken the emperor's robes courageously positioned himself on the imperial ship and fought bravely, killing many enemies before giving his life on behalf of his emperor. The Arabs surrounded him, thinking he was Constans himself, and after he had slain many of them, they finally killed him too. With their emperor having escaped in disgrace, the city of Constantinople now found itself completely defenseless. Arab armies, now firmly in control of Syria and the Mediterranean coast, were able to send frequent raiding parties deep into Anatolia. In 674, they felt confident enough to attempt the ultimate prize, a direct assault on the great city of Constantinople itself. The Arab fleet began by systematically capturing port towns along the coast, then established a naval blockade of Constantinople, attempting to slowly choke the life out of the city. Theophanes the Confessor recorded these terrifying events. In this year, in March, a rainbow appeared in the sky and all mankind shuddered. Everyone said it was the end of the world. The emperor at the time was Constantine IV, and he must have wondered whether this was finally the end of the empire that had once ruled all of Europe. But the Byzantines had one more card to play, a secret superweapon of absolutely terrifying power that would soon become famous around the world. This weapon was so mysterious that scholars still debate exactly what it was, and the Byzantines guarded its secret so jealously that today its name has become synonymous with the Greeks who developed it. That weapon was Greek fire, and it was about to change everything. But here's the thing, Greek fire wasn't just some fancy medieval flamethrower. This stuff was the ultimate weapon of its day, a liquid nightmare that could burn on water and stick to anything it touched. The secret formula died with the empire, but imagine liquid fire mixed with ancient engineering genius. When Arab ships got close enough to smell victory, Byzantine vessels would unleash streams of this burning mixture through bronze tubes. Ships didn't just burn, they melted into the sea like candles in a furnace. The psychological impact was even worse than the physical destruction. Arab sailors started calling it Roman fire and spread tales of Greeks who could set the very ocean ablaze. Some crews refused to sail against Constantinople, convinced the Byzantines had supernatural powers. But Greek fire was just the beginning of Byzantine survival genius. Over the next few centuries, storm after storm would crash against Constantinople's walls. Each time, enemies thought they had the empire cornered. Each time, they learned why this city was called the Queen of Cities. Those massive stone barriers, the treacherous currents of the Golden Horn, and that terrifying Greek fire formed a powerful trinity of defense that kept Asia and Europe at bay. Let's jump ahead to the 10th century and peek behind those legendary walls. What was it actually like to live in the world's most stubborn city? For Byzantine citizens, Constantinople wasn't just home, it was the center of the known universe. They called it the eye of the world and the reigning city, and honestly, they weren't wrong. This place made every other medieval city look like a backwater village. Picture this, you're a traveler approaching Constantinople after months on dusty roads. First, you'd see those impossible walls rising from the horizon like a man-made mountain range. Then the Golden Horn would spread before you, packed with ships from every corner of the earth. Finally, the city itself, 500,000 souls crammed into the most magnificent urban maze ever built. A Russian visitor named Stefan of Novgorod perfectly captured the overwhelming experience. Entering Constantinople is like entering a great forest. It's impossible to get around without a good guide, and if you try to do it without proper help, you'll be unable to see or visit a single sacred site. Another pilgrim named Anthony went full tourist mode, amazed at the sheer religious wealth. It's impossible to visit all the holy monasteries or see all the holy relics. There are thousands upon thousands of sacred remains and countless wonders which no words can describe. But Anthony got more than he bargained for when he tried to catch a glimpse of the imperial family. I soon lost my companions in the crowd and stepped up onto the base of a pillar to try and see them. Instead, I caught sight of the imperial family entering in the most luxuriously embroidered golden robes imaginable, wearing golden crowns that blazed like captured sunlight. Then reality hit. As the ceremony started, however, I was rudely knocked off the pillar by some of the imperial guards and sent sprawling onto the stone floor. Those guards might have been Varangians, Viking warriors who'd traded their longships for Byzantine gold. Imagine getting tackled by a Norse warrior in downtown Constantinople. Talk about culture shock. Walking through the city's maze of streets was like stepping into a living encyclopedia. The narrow passages wound between buildings made from those distinctive orange-brown Roman bricks, techniques passed down for centuries. Church bells rang out constantly, mixing with the haunting melodies of Byzantine chants that seemed to echo from every corner. But the real magic was in the sounds and smells that hit you from every direction. Seabirds called from the harbor, wooden shutters clattered in the breeze, and the babble of a dozen languages filled the air. As one 10th century knight named Bartholomew wrote, "In this city are Greeks, Bulgarians, Alans, Cumans, Pechenegs, Italians, Venetians, Romanians, Dacians, English, even Turks and many other peoples, converts, Cretans and Arabs. People of all nations come together here. The architecture told stories of wealth and poverty side by side. Rich houses featured iron doors studded with massive nails, courtyards surrounded by stables and storerooms, marble staircases that caught the light like frozen waterfalls. These mansions even had central heating, hypercaust systems inherited directly from ancient Rome, because why fix what isn't broken? Most people weren't so lucky. They burned charcoal in iron braziers and cooked on low hearths with square chimney pipes. During the day, Constantinople's skyline disappeared under a haze of cooking smoke, and the smells of wood fires and baking bread drifted over those famous terracotta rooftops like an urban perfume. The city's taste profile was as international as its population. The 11th century cook, Simeon Seth, recorded the arrival of cinnamon, which he thought came from northern Iraq, but had actually travelled all the way from Sri Lanka. Byzantines feasted on base and grey mullet from local waters, washed down with spiced wine called condite. They devoured sausages and that popular fermented fish sauce called garum. Imagine ancient ketchup with a serious attitude problem. New crops kept arriving like edible immigrants, aubergines from India, spinach from Persia, oranges and lemons from Arab lands. Each addition changed the aromatic symphony wafting through Constantinople's streets. Street performers turned the city into a constant carnival. Acrobats, jugglers and fire-eaters competed for coins and attention. One bishop of Cremona, visiting in 949, witnessed a performance that left him speechless. A man carried on his head, without using his hands, a wooden pole 24 feet or more long. Then two boys appeared who climbed the pole, did various tricks on it, and came down head first, keeping the pole as steady as if it were rooted in the earth. This filled me with great astonishment and admiration. But Constantinople had a dark side that visitors couldn't ignore. Being poor in this golden city was absolutely miserable. The fortunate poor lived in houses with rush roofs and beaten earth floors. The unlucky ones got crammed into towering tenement blocks, 5 to 9 stories of medieval poverty that made modern slums look luxurious. These skyscraper apartments were divided into tiny flats rented at extortionate prices to working people who had no other choice. One visitor, Odo of Jovi, passing through in 1147, delivered a harsh assessment. Constantinople is a city of extremes. She surpasses other cities in wealth, and she surpasses them in vice. Constantinople itself is crowded and smelly, and in many places shrouded in permanent darkness, for the wealthy overshadow the streets with their buildings and leave these dirty, dark places to the poor and to travellers. Here, murders and robberies and other crimes of the night are committed. People live beyond the reach of law in this city, for all its rich men are bullies, and many of its poor men are thieves. Yet even critics couldn't deny the city's electric energy. Food vendors filled the streets with sizzling aromas as different cultures mixed their culinary traditions. Nikita's Choniates described how people reveled and drank strong wine all day long. Some favored luxury foods, while others recreated their own native dishes: ox ribs, slices of salt pork with beans, sauces made with garlic, or combinations of other bitter flavors. The smells weren't just from food. Constantinople was legendary for its spice markets and perfumeries. The city's guild regulations give us a mouth-watering inventory. They are to sell pepper, spices, cinnamon, aloe wood, ambergris, musk, frankincense, myrrh, balsam, indigo dye, herbs, lapis lazuli, and storax. In short, any article used for perfumery and dyeing. Their stalls shall be placed in a row between the milestone and the revered icon of Christ, so that the aroma may waft upward to the icon and at the same time fill the vestibule of the royal palace. Exotic goods flowed in from impossible distances: sugar, ginger and sandalwood arrived from India. Nutmeg and cloves came from Indonesia, spices worth their weight in silver that had crossed oceans and continents to reach Byzantine tables. On special days when imperial processions and religious ceremonies transformed the city, the everyday medieval stench got buried under clouds of rosemary and pine, rose petals hanging in garlands, bundles of marjoram perfuming the air like natural incense. But what really struck visitors was the sheer, impossible scale of it all. At 500,000 people, Constantinople was larger than anything they'd ever imagined. Those massive walls, paved boulevards, spiraling columns reaching toward heaven, the vast palace complex, and above everything else, the golden dome of Hagia Sophia, catching sunlight like a captured star. The poet Constantinos of Rhodes captured what every visitor felt. After a long and wearisome journey, the traveler sees from a distance towers rising high into the air like mighty giants, columns that reach to the highest point, tall houses and temples whose vast roofs stretch to the heights. Who would not become instantly filled with joy? And when he reaches the wall and draws near to the gates, who does not greet the city, lower his neck, kneel to the ground, and grasp the famous earth? While Constantinople dazzled visitors, the world around it was transforming. Western Europe had crawled out of the post-Roman chaos into the Middle Ages. The Latin-speaking Western Empire had shattered into a patchwork of kingdoms, all speaking different languages but united under a Latin-speaking church. To sophisticated Byzantines, these Westerners seemed like crude barbarians. They called them Latins when being polite, Franks when they weren't. Rome had risen again, not as an imperial power, but as the center of Roman Catholicism under the Pope's authority. Translation differences between Greek and Latin religious texts naturally led to bitter theological arguments. In 1054, the East-West schism tore Christianity down the middle like a piece of parchment. Latin churches in Constantinople got shut down, excommunications flew back and forth across Europe like theological arrows, and the rift between Greeks and Latins only grew wider. Western Europe had embraced feudalism, a rigid system where high-born lords and ladies ruled by birthright, and peasants stayed peasants forever. But Byzantium operated differently. They had no legal noble class. Sure, there were wealthy and powerful families who used every trick to maintain their positions, but great dynasties could fall and nobodies could rise to imperial heights. Basil, founder of a great ruling dynasty, started as a peasant who traveled to Constantinople to escape rural poverty. He climbed Byzantine society's ladder all the way to the imperial throne. 4 Byzantine emperors were women. Try explaining that to a feudal Western king. This lack of rigid feudalism made Byzantium remarkably modern for its time. Western European kings ruled over fractious land-holding lords and feudal barons who constantly needed placating to prevent civil wars. These lords raised their own armies and taxed their own peasants, only uniting under the king's banner during major conflicts. But Byzantium collected taxes directly from provinces just like ancient Rome. They operated a centralized bureaucracy that paid magistrates, officials, and a powerful standing military. It was efficient, flexible, and absolutely terrifying to traditional feudal minds. Despite this efficiency, Byzantine emperors sat atop incredibly precarious pyramids of power. They were often elected rather than inheriting thrones, spending every moment under threat from courtiers, plotting palace coups, and military commanders who might grow too ambitious. Successful emperors ruled through delicate balancing acts, keeping peace between competing imperial interests. This created a constant paradox. Emperors needed competent people in important positions, but the most competent people were usually the most ambitious and therefore the most dangerous. Byzantine emperors developed clever tactics to handle these challenges. First, they didn't rule through family networks. Brothers, uncles, or cousins who might pose threats got shipped off to distant provinces the moment a new emperor was crowned, usually given inconsequential positions where they couldn't cause trouble. Imperial policy also prevented any general from commanding troops in his home province, a rule designed to stop generals from building large support bases and challenging imperial authority. As we saw earlier, this was a policy the Han dynasty of China should have adopted. As further insurance, many emperors gave powerful positions to people who couldn't take the throne, eunuchs or bishops. Later, these figures even commanded imperial armies. But the ultimate insurance policy was maintaining solid support among the empire's actual people and political elites. If people supported their emperor, coups were less likely to succeed. So emperors spent enormous energy trying to increase this support, especially in Constantinople. Despite its reputation in the West as despotic, incompetent emperors didn't last long in Byzantium. In the centuries following Islam's rise, the Byzantine Empire became exceptional at projecting soft power. Having discovered how costly wars could be, they preferred not to fight when possible. Byzantine kings let their capital city's majesty speak for itself. They allowed foreign princes and kings to compete for Byzantine princesses' hands, gave them imperial titles as honors, hosted young foreign princes in the capital, educating them among the empire's sophisticated aristocracy. Byzantines were also masters at creating vast ceremonies that impressed and overwhelmed foreign ambassadors. In 946, one delegation from Silesia was greeted in the imperial palace's reception hall, decorated with silk hangings, laurel wreaths, flowers, and silver chains. Persian carpets covered floors, rose water perfumed the air, and thousands of courtiers stood in ceremonial red, gold, and purple regalia, chanting along with the music of organs. The emperor sat on a throne modeled after biblical Solomon's seat, surrounded by mechanical moving animals powered by water and clockwork, silver birds, and lions that roared and warbled through intricate instruments in their throats. This throne could even be mechanically lifted into the air while ambassadors knelt before it. All this theatre served one purpose: projecting the message that visitors had arrived at Europe's eye, the new Rome, the center of the world. And it worked brilliantly. After one visit, Prince Vladimir of Kiev's ambassadors returned with this breathless report. We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such splendor or beauty. We only knew that God dwells there among men, and their service surpasses the ceremonies of other nations. But soft power didn't always work, and when it failed, there was always the Byzantine army. Byzantium's military was a large, powerful force. In the mid-10th century, it comprised roughly 140,000 soldiers, around 1% of the empire's population and 5% of all adult males. The army was divided into local defense forces called themata and professional standing armies called tagmata, mostly stationed in the capital. These different army types allowed battlefield flexibility while keeping checks on each other. They were often given joint command of provinces, meaning no single general could get ideas about turning his men's strength against the empire and making a bid for the throne. A lesson clearly drawn from the civil wars that once plagued the Western Empire. Byzantines also employed foreign mercenaries, usually small units of specialized soldiers from neighboring lands. But their most powerful military asset was their capital's formidable might, the untaken city of Constantinople. Over centuries, they enhanced the city's siege defenses even further. Byzantines constructed several hundred enormous underground cisterns to store water, meaning they'd never run out during even the longest sieges. The largest, known as the Basilica cistern, has 366 columns supporting its immense underground vaults. 3 great open-air cisterns built near the Theodosian walls were so massive that one today houses a football stadium. Byzantines also cast an enormous iron chain, its links thick as a man's arm, that could be winched across the Golden Horn's entire length, barring port entry to any attackers. Time and again, Byzantines would fall back to their city's defences, and there no attacker could defeat them. But through the 11th century, a new threat was rising that would prove too great for Byzantium to face alone. A challenge that would force them into difficult, painful compromises and eventually lead to their great capital's ruin and waste. This was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. From their homeland near the Aral Sea, the Turks had built an empire stretching across mainland Persia, the Middle East, capturing Baghdad's cultural center, and much of Syria and the eastern Mediterranean coast. In 1071, Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV of Diogenes considered them enough of a threat to march an army of 40,000 soldiers into Asia to meet them in battle around modern Armenia at a place called Manzikert. Romanos's army consisted of perhaps 10,000 professional Byzantine soldiers, with around 30,000 regional mercenaries from Georgia, Armenia, and Bulgaria, plus a large contingent of Turkish mercenaries and even some Norman knights led by a Frankish general. The march across Anatolia was long and brutal. Emperor Romanos didn't endear himself to his troops. He brought along a luxurious baggage train while they suffered hardship. Whispers spread among the soldiers, and the mood turned mutinous. On the battle's eve, Romanos split his army in two, intending to send half in a flanking maneuver against the Turks. Instead, these 20,000 soldiers seemed to simply disband, leaving him with only half his original force. Some Turkish mercenaries sensed they were on the losing side and defected to the Turkish Sultan, who welcomed them as brothers. In the ensuing Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantines were utterly destroyed, and Emperor Romanos was captured, the first Roman emperor taken prisoner in battle in over 900 years. When brought before the Turkish Sultan, the victorious ruler refused to believe the bloodied, tattered man was the mighty emperor of the Romans. But the Sultan was magnanimous in victory. Romanos stayed in captivity for a week, eating at the Sultan's table while the empire's surrender terms were negotiated. Manzikert's loss was devastating for Byzantium. While battle casualties weren't enormous, the morale blow was crushing. When Emperor Romanos returned, ransomed for 1.5 million gold pieces with several cities surrendered to the Turks and his daughter promised in marriage to a Turkish prince, the humiliation proved too much for his subjects. He was toppled from power and cruelly blinded, later dying from infection related to his wounds. Here's where the empire's real troubles began. Byzantium's succession system, cobbled together haphazardly and involving much bribery, deceit, and coup plotting, had worked fine during prosperous times. Under stress, it fractured completely. This emperor's toppling led to a 30-year period of unrest, civil war, and palace coups that damaged the Byzantine state far more than 1,000 Manzikert battles ever could have. Emperor Romanos had marched to Manzikert with over 40,000 troops, but less than a decade later, armies fighting in civil wars barely topped 4,000. There were virtually no Byzantine armies defending the east. Turks advanced easily, taking more cities. Right as the empire's armies were destroying each other, it was also losing the economic base required to rebuild them. In just a few years, Byzantines lost their entire vast Anatolian heartland, and enemies on all sides were emboldened. The catastrophe was so great that Byzantine historians rarely named the Battle of Manzikert, simply referring to it as that dreadful day. Historian Anna Komnenos, writing decades later, delivered this mournful assessment. The fortunes of the Roman Empire had sunk to their lowest ebb, for the armies of the East were dispersed in all directions because the Turks had overspread and gained command of countries between the Black Sea and the Hellespont, the Aegean Sea, and the Mediterranean. Another Byzantine historian, Michael Ataliats, was even more doom-filled. We were pressed on all sides by the bonds of death. For centuries, Western Europe had relied on Byzantines to hold back various Muslim empires' armies in Asia, but it was becoming clear they couldn't hold out alone forever. If Byzantium was to continue what the West saw as guarding Europe's gates, it would need greater military support. It would need a radical solution that would reshape Europe's balance of power. Into this desperate situation strode a militant, ambitious pope named Urban II, and he would usher in a new age of violence and conflict that would seek to restore Byzantium's power and standing, but which would ultimately threaten to tear the entire empire apart. Before becoming pope, Urban II had been a French noble with a vision of aggressive, expansionist Christianity. Soon, one Byzantine emperor would give him the chance to test it out. Emperor Alexios III Komnenos feared for his empire's future. His Asian lands had completely fallen into Turkish hands, and Byzantines had neither resources nor manpower to do anything about it. By 1095, even the great capital of Constantinople seemed potentially in danger, so Alexios sent out dramatic requests for help. As one anonymous Byzantine source recalls, Alexios everywhere sent letters heavy with lamentation and full of weeping, begging with tears for aid from the entire Christian people and promising very generous rewards to those who would give help. Alexios even sent requests to some of the empire's bitterest rivals, bishops of the Roman Catholic Church. In response to his letters, he'd probably expected the kind of help he'd gotten before, perhaps a few regiments of well-equipped Western knights to strengthen his beleaguered armies. He would get much, much more than he bargained for. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II called together the Council of Clermont and urged all present to take up arms under the cross's sign. For centuries, European pilgrims had traveled to Jerusalem, the site where that Jewish rebel was executed by occupying Roman forces and where the world's largest religion was born. This pilgrimage route usually took them through Byzantium, crossing the Bosphorus at Constantinople, and passing through the Cilician gates into Syria. But with Jerusalem in Turkish hands, Pope Urban had a vision of an armed pilgrimage that would spread fire and death in its wake. He declared they would recover Jerusalem and the East with the army they raised, promising that all who went to war on his behalf, from generals to the lowliest foot soldiers, would be forgiven all their sins. To the sin-obsessed people of medieval Europe, this was an incredible promise, and the response was enormous. Byzantine historian Anna Komnenos, daughter of Emperor Alexios and writing in the 12th century, gives an incredible description of this great army's arrival. Then came an innumerable, heterogeneous crowd collected from nearly all the Frankish countries, together with their leaders, kings, dukes, counts, and even bishops. One might have likened them to the stars of heaven or the sand poured out along the sea's edge, for these men hurried on to approach Constantinople in numbers as countless as there are leaves and flowers in springtime. This unruly horde contained more than 100,000 people, a vast migration of Westerners into the East. It was made up largely of mobs of poor peasants gathered from Western Europe's towns and villages who had marched across the continent looting and stealing everywhere they passed. They'd only reached the Rhineland in Germany when they ran out of provisions. In response, they lashed out at the sizable Jewish population living there, massacring villages and stealing food and livestock. Jewish poet and legal scholar Eliezer ben Nathan, writing around 1096, described these crusaders. Cruel foreigners, fierce and swift, Frenchmen and Germans who put crosses on their clothing and were more plentiful than locusts on the earth's face. When Emperor Alexios saw this vast horde gathered outside Constantinople's walls, his blood must have run cold. One particularly unruly group, led by Peter the Hermit, even began looting the countryside and burning Byzantine villages near the capital. The emperor had to dispatch troops to restore order. He must have wondered whether unleashing this fearsome force was worth the risk. But perhaps against his better judgment, he decided to make his deal with the devil. After all, these were Christians. Even if they were the rough, unsophisticated sort of Latin Christians commonly found in the West. If this unruly army was what it would take to protect his empire, he'd have to accept it. So he allowed this vast crusader army to cross the Bosphorus and help them with organization and supplies as they passed into Anatolia through the Cilician gates and into the Holy Land. The Crusaders, despite their general lack of experience and equipment, did remarkably well. Their vast army took Nicaea in 1097 and Antioch a year later. Jerusalem was reached in June 1099 and taken by assault 1 month later, with Crusaders massacring the defenders. For the next 200 years, there would be some form of Crusader presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, but this was just the beginning of a story that would reshape the entire medieval world, and the consequences of Alexios's desperate gamble were only starting to unfold. But here's where things get absolutely wild. These rough-and-tumble Crusaders didn't just pack up and head home after their victory dance in Jerusalem. Oh no, they had bigger plans. They carved up the Holy Land like it was a Thanksgiving turkey, setting up their own little kingdoms and city-states. Think of it as the medieval version of claiming the best spots on a beach, except instead of umbrellas they planted crosses and called it divine providence. These weren't just temporary military camps either. We're talking about full-blown settler colonies, complete with stone castles, trading posts and European-style governance. It was like watching a twisted preview of what European colonialism would look like centuries later. The locals must have been scratching their heads, wondering how a bunch of sweaty knights from thousands of miles away suddenly became their new landlords. And here's the kicker. Emperor Alexios's desperate gamble actually worked. For about 2 whole centuries, his risky bet paid off like a slot machine, hitting triple sevens. The 5 emperors of his Komnenos dynasty got to sit back and watch their empire flourish while their Muslim neighbors were too busy playing whack-a-mole with endless waves of Latin armies pouring in from the west. Picture this. While Damascus and Baghdad were constantly looking over their shoulders for the next Crusader army, Constantinople was having something of a renaissance. Trade routes reopened, the treasury filled up, and the empire's borders actually started expanding again. It was like having the world's most expensive security service. Sure, the Crusaders were crude and unpredictable, but they were your crude and unpredictable warriors. But every good con eventually gets exposed, and Alexios had unleashed forces that would make a hurricane look like a gentle breeze. The power of these crusades had shown the Byzantines something terrifying. Western Europe wasn't the backwater collection of mud-covered villages they remembered from the old days. These weren't the scattered remnants of Rome's western half anymore. The West had become its own beast entirely, a world buzzing with its own ambitions, its own conflicts, and most dangerously, its own interests that didn't always align with Byzantine dreams. The deal Alexios had struck was like inviting a pack of wolves to guard your sheep, then realizing the wolves had developed a taste for mutton and weren't particularly interested in leaving when dinner was over. These dark forces that had been unleashed were about to spiral completely out of control, bringing the entire empire of Byzantium to the very edge of total destruction. And when that reckoning finally came, it would arrive in the form of perhaps the most disgraceful military campaign ever conducted by a supposedly Christian army. They called it the Fourth Crusade, and it would make every previous disaster look like a minor inconvenience. The goal of this Fourth Crusade started out predictably enough: recapture Jerusalem, which was then controlled by the powerful Ayyubid Sultanate. Crusades had always been chaotic, poorly organized affairs that ran more like controlled anarchy than proper military campaigns. But the Fourth Crusade was about to set a whole new standard for absolute chaos that would make previous disasters look like well-oiled machines. Almost immediately, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and then some. The Crusaders had planned to march to Venice and buy passage on Venetian ships to the Holy Land. Simple enough plan, right? Wrong. When they arrived in Venice, they discovered they were broke. Completely, utterly, embarrassingly broke. They couldn't even afford the boat ride, let alone fund a proper crusade. The Venetians, those crafty maritime merchants, saw this financial disaster as a golden opportunity. They made the Crusaders an offer they couldn't refuse. "Hey, we'll give you those ships, but first you need to do us a tiny favor. See that town called Zara? It's held by our rivals, the Christian Kingdom of Hungary. How about you march over there and burn it to the ground for us?" The Crusaders debated this proposal for what must have been the longest strategy session in medieval history. They knew they were being asked to attack fellow Christians, which was about as far from the crusading ideal as you could get. But they also knew that without Venetian ships, their holy war was dead in the water before it even started. So they made a decision that would haunt them forever. Any action was justified if it ultimately led to the recapture of Jerusalem. They marched to Zara, laid siege to the city, and then sacked and burned it to the ground with all the enthusiasm of raiders rather than holy warriors. The reaction across Europe was immediate and devastating. Pope Innocent III issued an order of excommunication for the entire Crusader army, the spiritual equivalent of being kicked out of the club permanently. His condemnation was so scathing it could have melted steel. "Behold, your gold has turned into base metal, and your silver has almost completely rusted. Since departing from the purity of your plan and turning aside from the path onto the impassable road, you have withdrawn your hand from the plough. For when you should have hastened to the land flowing with milk and honey, you turned away, going astray in the direction of the desert." The leaders of the Crusader army, perhaps wisely, chose not to share this little detail about their excommunication with their troops. But while many viewed this massive, unruly army as a ticking time bomb, others saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime. Enter Alexios IV Angelus, a man whose story reads like a soap opera written by someone with a serious grudge against Byzantine politics. Alexios had been the son of a Byzantine emperor, but his father had been deposed in a coup that left the family in exile. Now he lived with his brother-in-law, the King of Germany, probably spending his days plotting revenge and his nights dreaming of imperial restoration. This guy had been nursing a grudge for years, fantasizing about his triumphant return to the throne of Byzantium. He'd been told his whole life that the people of Constantinople were just waiting for him to come back and save them from whatever tyrant currently occupied the throne. And he probably believed every word of it. When he heard about the failing Fourth Crusade, still heavily in debt to the Venetians, running out of money and spending the winter in the ruins of Zara like the world's most depressing camping trip, he saw his golden ticket. Alexios approached the leaders of the crusade with a proposal so tempting it was almost irresistible. "You take the city of Constantinople, put me on the throne, and I'll open the vast treasuries of Byzantium to pay off all your debts and fund the rest of your crusade to Jerusalem." It was like offering a credit card with unlimited spending to a group of people who'd just maxed out all their existing cards. The leaders of the crusade practically jumped over each other to accept this deal. When Pope Innocent heard about their new plans, he wrote to them again, pleading with them to stop this madness and cease their violence against fellow Christians. But it was like trying to stop a freight train with a strongly worded letter. It was far too late. The Crusaders set sail in April 1203 aboard a Venetian fleet that included over 100 ships specifically designed for transporting horses. But even during their journey to Constantinople, they began to notice some rather alarming warning signs that Emperor Alexios might not have quite the army of loyal subjects he'd boasted about. As one crusader leader, Count Hugh of St. Pol, recalls with what sounds like growing unease, "We passed by the arm of St. George and made port on solid ground in the direction of Hiron. This port lies 1 league from Constantinople. There we were stunned, very much astonished that none of the friends or family of the young man who was with us, nor any messenger of theirs, came to him who might tell him about the situation in the city." Translation: nobody came out to greet their supposedly beloved prince, not a single person. That should have been their first clue that this whole venture was about to go sideways in spectacular fashion. When the Fourth Crusade finally arrived at Constantinople on June 23, 1203, they found themselves staring at a city with approximately 500,000 inhabitants. One French historian and knight among them, Geoffrey of Villehardouin, wrote an account that perfectly captures the mixture of awe and intimidation the Crusaders felt when they first laid eyes on the greatest city in the world. All those who had never seen Constantinople before gazed very intently upon the city, having never imagined there could be so fine a place in the entire world. They noted the high walls and lofty towers encircling it, its rich palaces and tall churches, of which there were so many that no one would have believed it to be true had he not seen it with his own eyes and viewed the length and breadth of that city which reigns supreme over all others. There was indeed no man so brave and daring that his flesh did not shudder at the sight. Even these battle-hardened warriors, fresh from sacking cities and burning down towns, felt their knees go weak looking at Constantinople. This wasn't some backwater fortress they could knock over in an afternoon. This was the crown jewel of the medieval world, and they were about to try to crack it open like a walnut. The Byzantine civil wars had seriously weakened the state's military, and the city was now defended by a garrison of only 15,000 men. That included 5,000 of the legendary Varangian Guard, those Viking warriors who had sworn to defend the Byzantine emperors with their lives. But even with these fearsome northern warriors on the walls, the defenders were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The Crusaders crossed the Bosphorus in their fleet of more than 200 ships and immediately noticed that the great defensive chain had been drawn across the Golden Horn. Sir Hugh recalls the imposing sight. Then we made our way towards a certain heavily fortified tower known as Galata. A very great, excessively thick iron chain was fastened to it. It ran across the sea, stretching from the tower all the way to the city walls. After several unsuccessful assaults that cost the Crusaders heavy losses, they finally found success on April 12th. They managed to land their ships below the sea walls of Constantinople, which were much lower than the massive land walls that protected the western approaches to the city. The Crusaders anchored their ships directly against the walls and turned their vessels into floating siege towers. They swarmed up the masts of their ships, scrambling across hastily constructed catwalks to reach the ramparts above. Other ships landed troops on the shoreline who used picks and shovels to hack away at a gateway that the defenders had hurriedly bricked up in desperation. The city's defenders were slowly but surely beaten back, and the Crusaders managed to break the massive chain that protected the Golden Horn. They sailed triumphantly into the port of Constantinople and raised up their exiled prince, Alexios Angelos, proclaiming him emperor. But here's where reality came crashing down like a ton of Byzantine bricks. Alexios had promised the Crusaders that the people of Constantinople would welcome him with open arms, cheering him as their liberating hero. Instead, the sounds they heard were definitely not cheers. Half the population of Constantinople had indeed come out to see their liberator, but they were jeering at him from the city walls, hurling insults and probably a few other things that medieval chroniclers were too polite to record. The numbers of the Crusader army won out in the end, and the sitting emperor fled the city rather than face the music. Alexios Angelos was crowned emperor of the Romans on August 1st, but now came the moment of truth. All those grand promises about paying off the Crusaders' debts would have to be kept, and reality was about to bite him harder than a starving dog. Sir Hugh, writing to the Pope and desperately trying to make this whole conquest look like it had been divinely inspired, put the best possible spin on things. Our new emperor, with everything that he had promised us, fully and completely rendered, bound himself to us by oath to cross the sea with us in next March's voyage, accompanied by 10,000 soldiers, and to provide food for 1 year to the entire army of the Lord. But the actual situation was completely different and probably closer to a financial horror story. Alexios quickly discovered that he had vastly overestimated the wealth he would find in the imperial treasury. A century of civil wars had drained it nearly dry, and when the previous emperor fled the city, he had taken with him more than 1,000 pounds of gold along with priceless jewels. Basically, everything valuable that wasn't nailed down. With a large and increasingly restless Crusader army still camped in the city, growing more impatient by the day and demanding their promised payment, the new emperor Alexios ordered that the required funds should be raised by any means necessary. And any means necessary turned out to mean something that would make modern asset strippers blush. He ordered soldiers to march through the streets of Constantinople, bursting into churches and seizing any priceless works of Byzantine art they could find. These masterpieces of religious art, icons, golden altarpieces, jeweled crosses that had been venerated for centuries, were to be destroyed and melted down to strip them of their precious metals. The sight of their new emperor sending troops into the most sacred spaces of the city to destroy treasures that had been accumulated over centuries must have sent chills down the spines of every citizen of Constantinople. This wasn't just taxation. This was cultural vandalism on an industrial scale. But even with this desperate liquidation of the city's artistic heritage, Alexios had barely made a dent in the enormous sum he had promised to the Latin warriors. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were growing frustrated at their inability to fight Muslims in the Holy Land as originally planned. So they began taking out their aggression on Constantinople's small Muslim community, destroying mosques and persecuting anyone who looked like they might be from the wrong side of the religious divide. Constantinople had always lived up to its reputation as a cosmopolitan refuge for people of all backgrounds, and the city's residents came out in force to protect their Muslim neighbors from these foreign soldiers. In retaliation, the Crusaders decided to send a message by setting parts of the city ablaze. Riots soon broke out throughout Constantinople. These riots quickly escalated into a full-blown revolution, and the unfortunate emperor Alexios found himself caught in the middle of a perfect storm of his own making. He was swiftly overthrown by a rebel leader named Ducas, who had him strangled in February 1204, a rather permanent solution to the empire's leadership crisis. The Crusaders, now facing a new emperor who had absolutely no intention of honoring the debts promised by his predecessor, demanded that Ducas make good on those payments anyway. When he refused, probably while wondering what planet these people were from, the Crusaders embarked on a campaign of revenge and destruction that would make their previous actions look like a polite disagreement. What followed was 3 days of blood and fire that saw one of the world's greatest cities ravaged beyond recognition. The historian Nikitas Choniates, who lived through this nightmare in Constantinople, recorded what happened next with the kind of detail that makes your blood run cold. Constantine's fair city, the common delight and boast of all nations, was laid waste with fire and blackened by soot, taken and emptied of all wealth. The Crusaders began what can only be described as an unconstrained campaign of looting and destruction aimed at stripping every ounce of value from this magnificent city. Nicetas Choniates mourns the events of those dark days with words that still echo with pain across the centuries. Bloody raindrops did not pour down from the heavens, nor did the harvest turn blood red, nor did fiery stones fall out of the sky, nor was anything new observed. But many-legged and many-handed justice disappeared without the sound of footfall or handclap, as a zealous avenger fell silently and inaudibly upon the city and made us the most ill-starred of men. During those 3 nightmare days, countless works of priceless Roman and Greek art were either stolen or destroyed forever. The famous bronze horses that had decorated the hippodrome for centuries were ripped from their pedestals and sent back to Venice, where they still adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica today, a permanent reminder of this cultural catastrophe. Other ancient statues, some dating back to the classical period, were melted down to make bronze coins for immediate spending money. As Nicetas Choniates bitterly recalls, these barbarians, haters of the beautiful, did not allow the statues standing in the hippodrome and other marvelous works of art to escape destruction, but all were made into coins. Thus, great things were exchanged for small ones. It wasn't just art that suffered. The Crusaders systematically violated the city's most sacred spaces, destroying or stealing everything they could lay their hands on. Not even the tombs of the emperors inside the Church of the Holy Apostles were spared from this orgy of destruction. Thousands of Constantinople's civilian population were massacred during those 3 days, and most of the Byzantine aristocracy who managed to survive fled the city with whatever they could carry. Nicetas Choniates describes heart-rending columns of aristocratic refugees fleeing their homeland, only to be mocked for their misfortunes by their own former subjects. The peasants and common riffraff jeered at those of us from Byzantium and were thick-headed enough to call our miserable poverty and nakedness equality. Many were only too happy to accept this outrage, saying, "Blessed be the Lord that we have grown rich," buying up for next to nothing the property that their fellow countrymen were forced to offer for sale. For they had not yet had much to do with the beef-eating Latins, and they did not know that they served up bile like wine, nor that they would treat the Byzantines with utter contempt. Declaring a great victory for Christendom, the irony was apparently lost on them, the Crusaders selected an emperor from among their own ranks and divided the territory of the empire into various new Crusader states. The Byzantine Empire, as it had existed for nearly 1,000 years, was officially dead, fractured into pieces like a dropped vase. Constantinople itself was ruled by a Western emperor for the next 60 years, and its citizens had a special name for this period, Francocratia, or the rule of the Franks. But here's the thing about conquest, it's a lot easier than actually governing what you've conquered. The Latins soon discovered that running a large and fractious empire was considerably more challenging than sacking it. Over the course of their rule, they lost one territory after another, watching their empire shrink until it was reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople itself. Meanwhile, a number of competing Byzantine successor states at Nicaea and Trebizond claimed to be the true heirs of the empire. The last Latin emperor of Constantinople was a man nicknamed Baldwin the Broke. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about how well their empire was doing, I don't know what would. His financial problems were so severe that he was forced to sell off some of the city's most precious Christian relics just to keep the government running. He sent what was supposedly the crown of thorns worn by Jesus Christ to the West in exchange for desperately needed cash. He even sent one of his own sons to Venice as collateral for a loan. Imagine using your child as a security deposit because your credit was so bad. Baldwin's spectacular mismanagement eventually proved too much even for the people who had initially supported the Latin conquest. He was eventually ousted from the throne by a Byzantine lord who had been quietly building support for a restoration. In 1261, the throne of Constantinople returned to Byzantine hands, and much of modern Greece and the Asian territories were restored to the empire. But calling it a restoration was like calling a demolished house renovated after you've managed to rebuild the foundation and one wall. A monk named Ignatius travelled through the Byzantine countryside to Constantinople just a few years later in 1277, and his observations paint a picture of an empire that had seen far better days. Although the cathedrals are magnificent, we were greatly saddened to see the rest of the city had fallen on hard times. Its trade has been severely curtailed, and the outrageous new trading colonies of the wicked Latins have insinuated themselves to secure advantages at the expense of the Greeks. The spacious markets were mostly abandoned, and many of its fine stone churches were in a poor state of repair. The numbers tell the brutal story of what had happened to this once great metropolis. Over the decades since the sack and the catastrophic mismanagement of the Latin emperors, the population of Constantinople had barely begun to recover. By the end of Baldwin, the Broke's reign, it was home to no more than 35,000 people, a shadow of its former self. The city during this period must have been one of the most haunting places on earth. The streets that had once buzzed with the sounds of dozens of languages and the calls of merchants from across the known world were now eerily quiet. Merchant ships no longer crowded its harbours, and the great markets that had once been the beating heart of international commerce stood largely empty. Constantinople had become little more than a collection of villages scattered inside those ancient walls, separated by overgrown wasteland, abandoned fields, and the crumbling ruins of what had once been the greatest city in the world. One visitor, the Burgundian noble Bertrandon de la Brocquière, recorded his impressions in 1432 with barely concealed disdain. The city of Constantinople is made up of villages. There is much more open space than buildings. Another visitor during this period, an archbishop named Isidore of Kiev, wrote with obvious disappointment about what he found within those legendary walls. Although the city is large, only a modest number of people live there in relation to its size. Barely a third of the city is inhabited. The rest is made up of gardens or fields or vineyards or wasteland. The population consists of fishermen, merchants, artisans and cultivators. The nobles are few in number and weak as women. If we want to imagine what Constantinople might have looked like during this devastating period, we can look at modern examples of urban abandonment. Picture the war-torn buffer zone that has divided Nicosia in Cyprus since 1974. A depopulated district where nature has been allowed to reclaim what humans once built. In these abandoned areas, roof beams have collapsed and shattered tiles litter the ground. Wild plants burst through windows and walls, pushing their roots wherever the plaster has cracked. Churches and schools, houses and shops all crumble slowly, their rooms now open to the sky and turning into unplanned gardens of wild, rambling overgrowth. Even in the parts of Constantinople that remain populated, the city must have felt like a ghost town. It had been built to house more than 500,000 people, but now contained barely 10% of that number. Its wide avenues and vast markets, its perfumeries and spice bazaars, must have been virtually empty, silent and cold as packs of stray dogs wandered through streets that had once been among the busiest in the world. The Byzantine Empire was now truly a shadow of its former self, clinging to existence by its fingernails. And just when you might think things couldn't get any worse, the 14th century brought a series of disasters that would make the Fourth Crusade look like a minor inconvenience. First came the crop failures and the Great Famine of 1315, which spread hunger and desperation across Europe. But this was quickly followed by the arrival of an even greater catastrophe, one that would spread death and destruction to every corner of the continent. The Black Death was coming, and it would change everything forever. But here's where things get absolutely wild, because defending this ghost town wasn't going to be easy. Constantinople might have been a shadow of its former glory, but those walls, those magnificent, seemingly invincible Theodosian walls, they were still standing proud after nearly 1,000 years of telling invaders to buzz off. Picture this: Muhammad the Sexy, the ambitious young Ottoman Sultan, staring at these legendary fortifications that had never, and I mean never, been breached by force. These weren't just any walls, we're talking about a triple-layered defensive masterpiece that had laughed in the face of every army that dared to challenge it for almost a millennium. The inner walls stood 40 feet high, backed by massive towers that soared even higher into the sky. Behind that was a second wall, and behind that a third. Between each wall lay a deep moat that could be flooded at a moment's notice. This wasn't just military engineering, this was a statement carved in stone that said, "You shall not pass." But Muhammad wasn't your average conqueror. This guy had a plan that was so audacious, so completely bonkers, that it just might work. The 21-year-old Sultan had been dreaming of taking Constantinople since he was a boy, and he wasn't about to let some ancient stones stand in his way. The Sultan knew he needed something the world had never seen before, something that would make those ancient stones tremble and crumble like sand castles at high tide. And to pull off this impossible feat, he hired the services of a radical Hungarian engineer named Orban. Now here's the kicker, and this is where the story gets really juicy. Orban had actually knocked on the Byzantines' door first, offering his services to help defend their city. Can you imagine? The man who would ultimately destroy Constantinople first offered to save it. But the cash-strapped empire, probably thinking this foreign engineer was just another con artist with wild promises and impossible schemes, told him to take a hike. They couldn't afford his services, and besides, who was this Hungarian nobody claiming he could build weapons beyond their imagination? Big mistake. Monumentally huge mistake. So Orban, probably muttering some very unkind words about Byzantine penny pinching, packed up his blueprints and marched straight to the Ottoman capital. There he walked right up to Sultan Mehmed himself with an offer that would change the course of history forever. "Give me the bronze and the gold," Orban declared, with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was selling, "and I will build you a cannon such as the world has never seen." The young Sultan, intrigued by this bold foreigner, leaned forward. Could this Hungarian madman really build something powerful enough to bring down the legendary Theodosian walls that had stood unconquered for 1,000 years? Orban's response was pure genius, mixed with absolute arrogance. "I can cast a cannon of bronze with the capacity to launch whatever stone you desire. I have examined the walls of Constantinople in great detail, and I can shatter them to dust. Not just these walls, but the very walls of Babylon itself." Think about the audacity of that claim. Orban wasn't just promising to break some walls, he was claiming he could destroy structures that existed only in legend and biblical stories. This was either the confidence of a master craftsman or the delusion of a complete madman. The young Sultan was sold. He gave Orban everything: unlimited resources, the finest bronze in the empire, expert craftsmen, and complete creative freedom. Money was no object. Time was no concern. Mehmed wanted his superweapon, and he was willing to pay any price to get it. 3 months later, working day and night in the forges of Adrianople, the monster was born. Orban christened his creation Basilica, and calling it massive would be like calling the ocean slightly damp. This mechanical beast stretched over 10 meters long. Imagine trying to fit a city bus through your front door, and was so ridiculously heavy that it weighed as much as several dozen horses combined. The barrel alone was thick enough that a man could crawl inside it, and the bronze walls were reinforced to withstand explosions that could be heard for miles. This wasn't just a cannon. This was a bronze dragon that breathed stone and fire. But here's the really insane part. They had to literally reshape the landscape just to move this thing. Moving Basilica required a team of 60 oxen. That's an entire herd of the strongest animals available, plus 400 men working around the clock in shifts. We're talking about leveling hills that stood in the way, building reinforced bridges over ditches and rivers, and creating a path wide enough for this bronze behemoth to crawl toward Constantinople at the blistering speed of 4 kilometers per day. 4 kilometers! You could walk faster than this weapon of mass destruction could travel. The logistics were absolutely mind-boggling. Teams of men had to run ahead of the convoy, scouting the route and preparing the ground. Engineers followed behind, reinforcing roads that threatened to collapse under the weight. Supply wagons carried spare parts, barrels of gunpowder, and the massive stone projectiles that would soon be hurled at Constantinople's walls. Imagine being a Byzantine scout, hiding in the hills and watching this slow-motion apocalypse inching toward your city. Day after day, you'd send back reports. The monster moved 4 kilometers closer today. Every sunrise brought doom 4 kilometers nearer to your doorstep. But the Ottomans weren't just bringing one cannon. Oh no, that would be too simple. Mehmed had commissioned an entire artillery train. Smaller cannons flanked Basilica like a pack of bronze wolves following their alpha. Each one was a marvel of engineering in its own right, capable of hurling stone balls the size of human heads with devastating accuracy. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, one man was documenting everything with the precision of someone who knew he was witnessing the end of an era and wanted future generations to understand exactly how an empire dies. Nicola Barbaro, a Venetian surgeon living in the city, kept a journal that reads like a front-row seat to the apocalypse. His words give us an incredibly vivid picture of what it felt like to watch 1,000 years of history coming to a violent end. Barbaro wasn't just any observer. He was a medical man trained to notice details, to record symptoms, to document the progression of disease. And he approached the death of Byzantium with the same clinical precision he would use to chart a patient's decline. On that fateful day, in April 1453, Barbaro scribbled these chilling words in his journal. Muhammad Bey came before Constantinople with about 160,000 men and encamped about 2.5 miles from the walls of the city. Let that number sink in for a moment. 160,000 soldiers against a city defended by maybe 10,000 men. And that's counting every able-bodied person who could hold a sword or pull a bowstring. The math alone was terrifying, but numbers don't tell the whole story. This wasn't just any army, this was the military machine of an empire at its peak, led by elite Janissary units that had conquered most of southeastern Europe. These were professional soldiers, many of whom had been training for war since childhood. When the Sultan arrived with his massive army and his house-sized cannons, he wasted no time in announcing his intentions with the most terrifying sound the medieval world had ever heard. The Great Cannon Basilica was hilariously inaccurate by modern standards. This wasn't exactly precision warfare. Medieval artillery was more about psychological impact than surgical strikes. But when those massive stone projectiles found their mark, the destruction was absolutely catastrophic. These weren't your typical iron cannonballs that you might imagine from pirate movies. Iron cannonballs were still a future innovation. Auburn's monster hurled smooth spheres of marble and granite, each one weighing 3/4 of a ton. That's 1,500 pounds of stone flying through the air at tremendous speed before smashing into the ancient walls with the force of a small meteor. The logistics of firing this beast were absolutely insane. The amount of gunpowder required for each shot was so enormous that it filled barrels. The explosion was so violent that it could crack the bronze barrel if not properly managed. So the cannon had to be cooled with olive oil between firings. Gallons and gallons of precious olive oil poured over the superheated bronze to bring the temperature down. Picture the scene around this mechanical monster. Sweating Ottoman engineers swarming like ants around their bronze creation, the air shimmering with heat waves rising from its superheated surface, the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder mixing with the sizzle and steam of olive oil hitting hot metal. And then boom, an explosion so loud it could be heard for miles, echoing off the walls of Constantinople like the voice of an angry god announcing the end times. The ground would shake, horses would rear in terror, and birds would flee from trees for miles around. Inside the city, the psychological warfare was just as devastating as the physical bombardment. Basilica could only fire 3 times a day because of the cooling requirements and the time needed to reload such a massive weapon. But those 3 thunderous explosions were enough to terrorize an entire population. Every time that cannon roared, morning, afternoon, and evening, every citizen of Constantinople must have ducked instinctively, looking up at their ancient walls and wondering if this would be the shot that finally brought them down after 1,000 years of standing unconquered. Children would cry at the sound, adults would cross themselves and pray. Even the most hardened defenders felt their hearts skip a beat each time they heard that terrible thunder rolling across the landscape. Barbaro captured the frantic desperation of the defenders trying to repair the damage. The Venetians set about making repairs where needed at the broken walls. These repairs were made with barrels filled with stones and earth, and behind them was made a very wide ditch covered with strips of vine and other layers of branches drenched with water to make them solid. Can you imagine the resourcefulness born of desperation? They were using wine barrels, furniture, pieces of demolished houses, anything they could find to plug the gaps that Basilica was blasting in their ancient defenses. Strips of vine and wet branches became emergency fortifications. This wasn't military engineering, this was improvised survival. For 48 days this deadly dance continued. The Ottomans would blast holes in the walls during the day, and the Byzantines would frantically patch them up during the night with whatever materials they could scavenge from their dying city. But the Turks weren't just relying on their monster cannon to win this siege. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers stormed the walls in coordinated assaults, led by the elite Janissaries, the Sultan's personal guard, who fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. These weren't ordinary soldiers. The Janissaries were recruited as children from Christian families across the Ottoman Empire, converted to Islam, and trained from boyhood to be the ultimate warriors. They knew no fear, accepted no defeat, and considered dying in battle for their sultan to be the highest honor possible. Barbaro describes the horrifying courage of these warriors, and his words chill the blood. They found the Turks coming right up under the walls, particularly the Janissaries. When 1 or 2 were killed, more Turks came and took away the dead ones without caring how close they came to the city walls, how men shot at them with guns and crossbows. They would aim at the Turk, carrying away his dead countrymen, and both would fall to the ground, dead. Then other Turks would come and take them away. None feared death. They would rather let 10 of themselves be killed than suffer the shame of leaving a single Turkish corpse behind. This wasn't just warfare. This was fanatical devotion to a cause. The Janissaries treated death as casually as other men treated breakfast. They would climb over the bodies of their fallen comrades to retrieve the wounded and dead, knowing full well that crossbow bolts and gunfire were raining down on them. In their darkest hour, facing impossible odds, the Byzantines reached deep into their ancient heritage for strength. Emperor Constantine V standing on those crumbling walls with his vastly outnumbered defenders, delivered what might be one of history's most defiant battle cries. Hurl your javelins and arrows against them so that they know they are fighting with the descendants of the Greeks and the Romans. Even facing annihilation, Constantine V wasn't going to let his men forget who they were. They weren't just defending a city, they were the last heirs of Alexander the Great, of Julius Caesar, of Augustus. They carried in their veins the blood of the people who had conquered the known world and built an empire that lasted over 2 millennia. The siege of Constantinople has been told countless times. The fighting on the water, the defenders waiting for Venetian reinforcements that never came, the Turkish engineers digging tunnels under the walls like massive moles trying to burrow into the city's belly. There was Sultan Mehmed's brilliant and audacious plan to carry his ships overland, literally dragging entire warships across dry land on wooden rollers to bypass the massive chain that blocked the Golden Horn. Imagine the shock of Byzantine defenders when they looked out over what they thought was their protected harbour and saw enemy ships floating there as if by magic. But what really gets me, what keeps me awake at night thinking about this story, is imagining what it felt like to be an ordinary person trapped inside those walls, watching their world literally crumble around them stone by stone, day by day. Every morning brought the sound of picks and shovels as work gangs tried to repair the previous day's damage. Every afternoon brought the thunder of cannons and the crash of stone hitting stone. Every evening brought the knowledge that tomorrow would be worse than today. The daily routine of survival became a ritual of desperation. Prayers echoed through the Hagia Sophia, the haunting, otherworldly chanting of Byzantine monks drifting over a city that knew its time was running out. Their voices carried ancient melodies that had been sung in that sacred space for nearly 1,000 years, but now those songs felt like funeral dirges. Outside the walls, the rolling thunder of cannon fire sounded like an approaching storm that would never pass. The sharp crack of smaller guns punctuated the air like deadly firecrackers, while the earth-shaking boom of the massive bombards made buildings sway and dust fall from ceiling beams. When the wind was right, the streets must have reeked of gunpowder from the Turkish cannons positioned far beyond the walls. The smell would cling to clothes, seep into food, and remind everyone that death was literally in the air they breathed. Barbaro noted the growing desperation as supplies dwindled. The city was in great distress because of a growing lack of provisions, particularly bread, wine, and other necessities of life. Bread, the most basic human need, was becoming scarce in a city that had once fed hundreds of thousands. Wine, which had flowed like water in Constantinople's glory days, was now rationed, drop by precious drop. People began eyeing their neighbors' possessions, wondering what could be traded for another day's food. As hunger gnawed at empty bellies and hope dwindled like sand through an hourglass, the superstitious began seeing omens everywhere. In times of crisis, people looked to the heavens for signs, and the heavens seemed to be screaming warnings. On May 22nd, Barbaro recorded something that chilled the defenders to their very bones. There appeared a sign in the sky which was to tell Constantine, the worthy emperor, that his proud empire was about to come to an end. At the first hour after sunset, the moon rose as if it were no more than a 3-day moon, with only a little showing, although the air was clear and unclouded. The moon stayed in this form for about 4 hours and gradually increased to full circle. When Christians and pagans had seen this marvelous sign, the emperor was greatly afraid, and so were his nobles, because the Greeks had a prophecy that Constantinople would never fall until the full moon should give a sign. Imagine the terror that swept through the city when people saw that lunar eclipse. Here was their ancient prophecy coming true before their very eyes. The moon itself seemed to be announcing the end of their world. The psychological pressure was crushing everyone, from the humblest citizen to the emperor himself. Barbaro writes with heartbreaking clarity about Constantine the Byzantine's final despair. The most serene emperor began to weep bitterly for grief because the Venetians had not sent help. When the emperor saw this, he decided to put himself in the hands of our most merciful Lord Jesus Christ and of his mother Madonna Saint Mary and of Saint Constantine, defender of his city. The last emperor of Byzantium, descendant of Caesar Augustus, heir to 1,000 years of imperial glory, reduced to tears because his allies had abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. As the walls were pounded into rubble by those enormous Turkish guns, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks of the defenders. Even high-ranking commanders, men who had sworn sacred oaths to defend the city, began abandoning their posts. The most devastating blow came when Giustiniani, the Genoese captain who had been put in charge of the city's defences, essentially the top military commander, suddenly fled to his ship in the harbour, crying out as he ran through the streets, "The Turks have got into the city!" His panic was utterly contagious, spreading through the streets like a plague of despair. If their own commander was fleeing, what hope did ordinary defenders have? Meanwhile, outside the walls, the Turkish camp was ablaze with celebration that could be seen from the city's towers. Barbaro could see their fires burning through the night. The Turks set fires blazing brightly through their whole camp. Every tent lit 2 fires of great size, and the light was so strong that it seemed like day. These fires burned until midnight, and the Sultan had them lit to encourage his men because the time was coming for the destruction of the city. The contrast must have been devastating for the defenders to witness. Inside the walls, hunger, fear, despair, and darkness. Outside the walls, celebration, confidence, abundance, and light blazing so brightly it turned night into day. The final assault began at sunrise on May 29, 1453. Turkish soldiers swarmed over the walls like a human tsunami, and Barbaro's description reads like something from Dante's vision of hell. The Turks entered the city near San Romano, where the walls had been razed to the ground by their cannon. After being driven back from the outer fortifications, the Turks fired their great cannon again, and the pagans came on behind the smoke like hounds, raging and pressing on each other like wild beasts, so that in the space of a quarter of an hour there were more than 30,000 Turks inside the city. With such cries and shouting it seemed like a very inferno, and the noise was heard as far away as Anatolia. 30,000 enemy soldiers inside the city in 15 minutes. The mathematics of conquest had finally overwhelmed the mathematics of defense. Just like the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade 2.5 centuries before, the Ottomans rampaged through the city in an orgy of violence and looting. The bloodshed was tremendous, and Barbaro's clinical medical eye recorded it with devastating precision. All through the day the Turks made a great slaughter of Christians through the city. Blood flowed in the city like rainwater in gutters after a sudden storm, and the corpses of Turks and Christians were thrown into the Dardanelles, where they floated out to sea like melons along a canal. Emperor Constantine the Byzantine had vanished into the chaos of battle like a ghost dissolving into mist. Some said his body was found among the corpses near the San Romano gate. Others claimed he had taken his own life when the Turks broke through the walls rather than face capture and humiliation. The truth is, nobody knows exactly how the last emperor of Byzantium died, but we know he died fighting, sword in hand, defending his city to the very end. The man who could have fled, who could have negotiated surrender, who could have saved his own life, chose instead to die as a Roman emperor should, in battle, protecting his people. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror strode through the ruined streets. victorious at last. When he entered the crumbling ruins of the ancient palace of Bucolion, built by Emperor Theodosius 1,000 years earlier, he reportedly quoted lines from the Persian poet Ferdowsi that perfectly captured the melancholy scene spreading before his eyes. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars, the owl calls the watchers in the towers of Afrasiab. Even in his moment of greatest triumph, Mehmed understood that he was walking through the graveyard of history itself. The Byzantine Empire had lasted 1,023 years and 18 days, but now the great liturgy that had echoed from the dome of Hagia Sophia for nearly a millennium fell silent forever. The last prayers in Greek had been sung, the last emperor had fallen. The last chapter of the Roman Empire had finally come to its end. A few scattered Byzantine lords held on to fragments of the empire for a few more years, clinging to remote islands and mountain strongholds like survivors on the wreckage of a great ship. But by 1461 they had all surrendered or been conquered. The dream of Rome, which had begun with Augustus over 1,400 years earlier, was finally and completely over. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Mehmed the Conqueror was uncontent to simply destroy Byzantium. This remarkable young man, barely 21 years old, moved his capital to Constantinople and gave himself the title of Caesar. Even the conqueror of Byzantium understood the power and legitimacy that came with that ancient Roman legacy. He began ambitious renovations of Constantine's city, creating magnificent gardens that one historian described as burgeoning with various fine plants, bringing forth fruits in season, flowing with abundant streams, cold, clear, and good to drink, studded with beautiful groves and meadows, resounding and chattering with flocks of singing birds. Mehmed wasn't just conquering a city, he was inheriting a civilization and making it his own. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the Turkish camp was ablaze with celebration that could be seen from the city's towers. Barbaro could see their fires burning through the night. The Turks set fires blazing brightly through their whole camp. Every tent lit 2 fires of great size, and the light was so strong that it seemed like day. The contrast must have been devastating for the defenders to witness. Inside the walls, hunger, fear, despair, and darkness. Outside the walls, celebration, confidence, abundance, and light blazing so brightly it turned night into day. The final assault began at sunrise on May 29, 1453. Turkish soldiers swarmed over the walls like a human tsunami, and Barbaro's description reads like something from hell itself. The Turks entered the city near San Romano, where the walls had been razed to the ground by their cannon. The pagans came on behind the smoke like hounds, raging and pressing on each other like wild beasts, so that in the space of a quarter of an hour there were more than 30,000 Turks inside the city. The noise was heard as far away as Anatolia. 30,000 enemy soldiers inside the city in 15 minutes. The mathematics of conquest had finally crushed the mathematics of defense. The Ottomans rampaged through the city in an orgy of violence and looting. Barbaro recorded it with devastating precision. Blood flowed in the city like rainwater in gutters after a sudden storm, and the corpses floated out to sea like melons along a canal. Emperor Constantine X vanished into the chaos of battle like a ghost dissolving into mist. Nobody knows exactly how the last emperor of Byzantium died, but we know he died fighting, sword in hand, defending his city to the very end. And just like that, after 1,023 years and 18 days, the Byzantine Empire was over. The last prayers in Greek had been sung, the last emperor had fallen, the final chapter of Rome had come to its end.